Welcome. Tonight, you will walk into another time, another silence, a path through rain and mountain, a place where honor and memory breathe in every step. This is a tale of the samurai, a tale of loyalty, betrayal, and the weight of a brother's absence. Let the sound of rain guide you. Let the stillness of night carry you. Close your eyes and follow Takeshi as he returns to the land that remembers him and to the silence that waits beyond the gates.
Rain lay over the mountains in gentle veils, a soft and steady presence that smoothed sharp stone and quieted the stray voices of wind. It had been falling since dawn and showed no hurry to leave, a faithful rhythm on pine needles and slick roots. On folded cloth and the curved rim of a straw hat, on the open slope and the shaded hollows where water pooled and remembered the sky. The path wound upward in calm switchbacks, narrow but sure of itself, the kind of way that had learned to trust its own patience. Takeshi followed it without pressing for speed, letting each step find its place and settle before inviting the next. A calm procession of motion that released thought the way rain releases light. The mountain smelled of wet earth and resin, of living wood and soft bark. Pine branches bent beneath the weight of droplets and let them go in a measured splatter, a bead gathering, swelling, releasing, as if counting in a language older than words. From time to time, the air carried the faint mineral cool of stone struck by cold water, and beneath that, a trace of crushed leaves where the heel had met a fallen branch and turned it to scent. He breathed through these changes without naming them, allowing his chest to rise and fall as part of the weather, and with each breath the noise of elsewhere diminished, until all that remained was the path, the rain, and the body that belonged to both. His sandals, darkened to the color of river mud, pressed softly into the wet soil. When they rose, they left shallow impressions that filled at once with rain, little mirrors that caught a blurred sliver of sky and a wavering edge of green. The thong's touch across the top of his foot was familiar, a simple pressure held. And placed by habit, between toes and heel, the mud pulled gently, reluctant to release what it had accepted, and then let go with quiet grace. The sound was small and satisfying, a low note most clear when his attention softened. Foam gathered in the edges of puddles where raindrops met and joined and unjoined. Here and there, the path accepted a flat stone into its narrowness, and he stepped on its slick surface to share the weight. With something that did not mind being Asdot at his side, hung a sword dressed in worn cloth. The cloth had faded across seasons, from deep dye to a kindly dusk frayed at the edges, where fingers had tended it in poor light, stained where weather had been stronger than care. It rested against him the way a remembered duty rests against a heart that has already said yes, not demanding, simply present. When the rain gathered along the wrap and ran down the scabbard, it carried a faint trace of oil and lacquer, a mixture that was neither unpleasant nor strong, only there if fit. Breath went looking. The hilt sat in its accustomed angle, balanced in the quiet mathematics of long practice. And yet, for all its familiarity, it was lighter in the scale of this day than the inward weight he carried. Thoughts of Kazuo returned as a low tide returns, to a calm shore, not sudden, not sharp, but strong enough to shape the space around them. No image insisted on itself. There was no single moment that demanded attention. Instead, there was a gentle accumulation, the way a hand once corrected a stance with a careful tap, the way morning smoke moved through hair tied back with habitual neatness, the way a horse was quieted before a ford by the simple, repeated touch of palm to neck. A memory of dried fish shared without comment on the winter road, the firmness of advice that never needed to be said twice. These arrived and drifted away like the fine fog that rose from the path when the rain eased for a breath. Kazuo's absence, had weight, but it did not crush. It settled like a stone at the base of a stream, changing the pattern of water without trying to hold it still. Takeshi climbed with an economy that belonged to someone who had learned the value of energy by spending it. The cloak across his shoulders darkened and grew heavy and then familiar again, a wetness that became part of his shape. Beneath it, old scars warmed and cooled in quiet answer to the air, not forgotten but not in need of notice. He left speed. To others, the mountain rewarded this choice with small mercies, a patch of path less muddy than expected, a slope that looked steeper than it felt, a pine whose roots held the earth where it might otherwise have slipped. When the path narrowed, he placed his foot with care over the pressed needles of previous travelers. When it widened, he let his stride lengthen only enough to please the breath. A pair of drab birds fluttered from the underbrush, lifting a spray of drops from leaves that shivered and then stilled. A squirrel crossed a log with the composure of one who had done so many times, its tail a dark brush dampened into line, its claws making small, decisive points in the moss. Water traced the grooves in a stone carved centuries ago and lay in. The shapes men had believed would please the spirits of the mountain. It was only water, and yet there was a correctness to its path. The mountain accepted reverence and indifference with equal ease. Takeshi walked in the space between the two. There were places along the way where a human hand had corrected nature, a crude stair cut into a steep turn, a stake driven at an angle to hold a rope for doubtful balance, a small cairn set to reassure those who look for signs. Rain softened each of these until the hand's intent was only a suggestion. He used the stair and the rope when they offered themselves. He saw the cairn and felt no need to add to it. The mind had its own stones. He fought quiet markers that needed no witness. He could feel them now, the first time he set aside anger because it would waste a friend. The day he rose before a light and understood there would be many such days and did not resent them. The evening when he ceased to wish for praise and discovered work was easier without it. These were not grand realizations, only the small turning of a path from one line to another. Some sounds attached themselves to the steady music of rain and then released. The roll of water in a hollow trunk, the distant shift of rock after a small slide, the soft knock of the sheath against his knee when a misjudged root altered his stride. There was no need to tense for threat. The mountain held no ambush for a man who moved like weather. Even the wind's occasional lift at the edge of his hat arrived without edge, sliding across the wet brim and off again. He let his shoulders fall when they wanted to rise, let his jaw soften when it remembered to clamp. The body remembered. Conflict like a story, but a story repeated in this rain lost its sharpness and became part of a larger lullaby. He thought, not for the first time, of how the world had continued while he'd been away. Rivers had swollen and receded, rice had been planted and harvested, roofs had been thatched and repaired, and the stronghold had gone on with its own breathing, doors sliding and closing, incense spun through rooms at the measured pace of worship, footsteps making small logic in corridors, the daily turning of a lord's mind toward order. He could picture the inner garden in late afternoon, when the light lengthened across sand raked into a pattern that even rain could not entirely erase. The ripples in gravel, each curve chosen by a patient hand. He did not dwell there long. The images were gentle, and gentleness asks to be allowed, not held. The path curled under a low arch of branches where the pine had leaned toward a clearing, its weight distributing across a network of roots that hummed with rain. Needles, wet and bright, brushed the shoulder of his cloak and beaded along the edge before sliding off in a faint cascade. His fingers adjusted the cloth at his hip with an absent economy, the sort of motion that could have been a ritual if it were not so practical. The sword's wrap had a roughness softened by time, and his palm recognized each imperfection as one recognizes the familiar patch in a well-used garment. Once, that roughness had marked alertness. Today, in the weather's steady hush, it signaled only companionship. Kazuo's face did not come as grief often comes, full and unstoppable. It arrived as a soft pressure at the base of the throat, as a tenderness in breath that did not precede tears, but rather a kind of agreement with the air. It was easy, while walking, to believe he might come into view around the next switchback older. As a man should be older, marked by travel in the same ways, the same careful pace on whetstone. The mind offered the thought and then released it, leaving behind the truest part, the care that remains when the person does not. Takeshi accepted the distance between that offering and the day and moved on, the rain steady and disciplined. Taught a kind of listening that consumes no effort. It was never perfectly the same from 100 steps to the next. Sometimes the drops struck leaves first and the sound reached him muted, as if the mountain were thinking. Sometimes they hit open rock in direct percussion, each drop a small clear tap in a wide pattern. Sometimes the rain found moss and sank without a sound, contributing its shape to green without commentary. In all of these differences, there was a sameness, the world lowering itself gently onto the world. He noticed the way water gathered along a route and fed a thin channel that worked its way across the path, carving a shy groove he had not seen last season. He stepped over it and thought that paths, like men, remember where they have been changed. He noticed how a broken branch had caught on a shrub and hung at a precise angle where the rain had polished its cut to a clean, pale oval. He noticed how his own breath made a soft cloud when he paused, even though the air was not cold. The warmth of exertion giving something back to the day as thanks. A ridge revealed itself slowly, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gentling of incline, and a thinning of trees, the canopy lifting to reveal a whiter gray. The path gifted a few flat steps that asked for no calculation. He followed the gift and felt the stretch of muscle along his calves release. In this release, there was permission to remember more openly. He thought of evenings beside streams where the sun laid a road across the water and Kazuo had sat slightly apart. Not because he wished to be alone, but because he wished to see each thing as itself before speaking. He remembered that stillness and understood, perhaps better now, how it fed strength that did not need to display itself. There are forms of discipline that are directions more than rules. This, too, had become part of his body. When the trees finally set themselves back and the sky came down in a long, smooth sheet of cloud, the valley offered its quiet face. The rain made distance gentle. Fields lay in squares and long strokes. Hedges softened, the river a cool ribbon threading among them. Beyond, in the place where land chose to rise and defend itself, stone gathered into walls. Even in weather, those walls kept their line, untroubled by ornament, confident in their ongoing task. Faint lights held in the mist, steady as thoughts. That have earned their place, a thin necklace of fire along the parapets, seen and nearly unseen at the same time. Banners hung there, and every now and then the wind remembered them and asked them to move. They answered with a small breathing, motion, and rested again. The sight brought no surprise. It felt like a known word encountered on a new page. Takeshi let his gaze remain on the distant stronghold and allowed a day long in arriving to touch where it needed to touch. He did not shade his eyes or narrow them. He did not look for specific windows or roofs. It was enough to see that the place continued. In his mind, he placed it where it belonged, not in conquest or defeat, not in the theater of power, but in the rhythm of duties that make a shape around sleep and waking. He understood that within those walls, men and women went about their movements, small and essential, and that every motion rested upon countless quiet choices. He wondered for the space between two breaths whether his own choices would again be asked to fit that structure. The thought did not sharpen. It simply joined the larger weather. He stood without haste, letting the rain find its path down his hat and along his face, down his neck and into the collar's shelter. The water's touch was cool and in places finely cold, like clean cloth, laid across a fevered brow. Each drop made its own map and joined a river he could not see. He moved one hand slightly to ease the cloak from catching against the hilt, and then held still again, feeling the simple gratitude of a stance that cost nothing. Beneath his feet, the ridge was firm. Beneath the ridge, the mountain cared nothing for names, and this too felt kind dot around him. Low shrubs offered the scent of crushed green when the rain pressed them. The smell rose, folded, disappeared, returned. A small insect worked its way from under a wet stone and paused, and the rain glittered on its back before it found shelter again. The world proceeded in this manner, a procession of small continuations. He had learned the comfort of such continuations in years that made harsh demands. Those years had also taught him to avoid looking too closely for meaning where there was only the clarity of what is. In this he found rest. He thought of the road behind and did not inventory it. He thought of the days ahead and did not judge them. He allowed the present to be a bridge between the two, a bridge that did not need a name. When the mind wanted to create a list, he let the list dissolve and return to the feel of the rain on his hands, the saturated weight of cloth at the wrists, the loosened warmth at the base of his spine where effort had gathered and then softened. He allowed the body to unclasp old grips. He allowed the memory of his brother to take the shape of breath dot at the edge of the ridge. Where the first stones began to fall again toward the slope, a narrow pool had formed in a shallow depression. The surface accepted the pattern of drops. With exquisite patience, rings widened, crossed, and then faded into a smoothness that immediately received the next circle. Takeshi watched this modest ceremony and felt the same movement in himself. Events arriving, making their pattern, passing, and leaving a surface ready to accept again. He thought, but did not say, that perhaps this was one of the mountains. Simplest teachings. A bell, far in the stronghold, lifted a single tone into the weather. The sound came thin with distance, wrapped in rain. The way a voice sounds when heard through a paper wall while you are almost asleep. It did not summon or forbid. It simply marked time's soft crossing, and then the rain took it and folded it away. The walls did not change. The valley did not move. He remained where he was, and in remaining, arrived more fully. If there was a threshold, it did not lie in stone or footfall, but in a change of attention. As he stood, he let his gaze shift from the stronghold to the space between, to hedges, and ditches and rooftops of soaked thatch that belonged to people whose names he did not know and did not need to know. Thin smoke rose from one of those roofs in a pale column. Somewhere, a door would be slid closed against the weather. A child asked to sit nearer a fire. Rice turned once with a wooden spoon to lift the heat from the bottom to the top. The knowledge of these ordinary movements offered a ground more steady than allegiance. He let his heart stand on that ground and felt the rain relax its chill around him. Kazuo's absence settled again into its rightful place, not a current that would pull him under, not an edge to be avoided, but a tone that would always underlie the day. He felt the tone in his bones as one feels a drum played at a distance, the sound both within and without. It kept time without counting. In keeping time, it held him upright. Memories returned and folded themselves back. He gave each one the courtesy of acknowledgement and then allowed it to rest. Grief, received in this way, became quiet enough to travel with. The light was even and without emphasis, as it often is in steady rain. There was no drama in the sky, only a gray that knew its work and did it well, diffused and soft, kind to every surface. The valley's greens were tender under such light, the browns rich, the stones convincing. Even the distant torches showed their warmth carefully, as if aware that too much insistence might break the hour's calm. He allowed his eyes to soften, to receive rather than reach, and in the loosening felt a simple ease enter his shoulders and hands. He did not count how long he stood. The mountain is generous with those who do not hurry it. When at last he shifted, his weight slightly only enough to remind the body it had a right foot and a left. The motion was as gentle as a thought changing direction during an afternoon nap. He found the pressure of the sword against his side and recognized it without armor, without urgency, simply part of the body silhouette. The cloth wrap brushed his knuckles when he adjusted the cloak, its texture slightly rougher where the weave had spread. He rubbed the spot once, and in that small act there was a warmer memory. The day the wrap had been replaced, the scrolls of thread on a table, the quiet talk of the woman who had taught him to bind it so the knot would never slip toward the wrong hand. He looked again at Lord Kensei's stronghold, half present and half a suggestion in the soft weather, and let it be what it was, a place of rules and rooms, of thought made into instruction of people whose days depended on each other, in ways rarely noticed. He felt no rise of anticipation, no quickening. The body kept to its calm. The mind remained friendly to the moment. The rain made a fine beaded line across the edge of his hat and then released it, and the release was almost silent. When the wind came, it came as a companion rather than a challenge, moving from his left, drying nothing, cooling nothing further, simply reminding him that even air travels. It lifted the wet hem of his cloak a finger's width and set it down again. It worked through the pines below the ridge and brought a series of soft sighs out of them, as if the trees were agreeing to one another's presence. The wind carried a hint of river-clean, metallic, carrying distance in it, and then let that hint go when the rain reminded it whose hour this was. He remained, a single upright figure in an uncomplicated posture, and allowed the ridge to be a place of rest. The mountain held him, the rain clothed him, the path waited without impatience, the stronghold kept its measured lights. Somewhere, the low call of a herdsman pushed through the weather and faded. The call pried nothing up from within him. It merely joined the day's pattern and took its place as a strand among many. Breath by breath, he understood that return could be this, too. Not the high crest of a heralded wave, not the clang of gates and the formalities of entry, but a quiet, standing where the land opens and the heart remembers how to be still. He did not need to step forward to claim the truth of it. He did not need to speak. He needed only to remain long enough for the ridge to remember his weight and for the rain to learn his shape. Evening would come, but the sky did not yet carry that color. The gray remained consistent and welcoming. The torches along the wall glowed a little more as the day's light eased, not as an argument against darkness, but as a courtesy to those who might need a point to move toward. Takeshi received that courtesy with steady eyes, and in doing so offered a courtesy back. The still agreement of a traveler who has reached the place where he is meant to pause. He stood motionless in the rain, the worn-wrapped sword at his side, the mud accepting the outline of his sandals and filling it with water, as if trying to keep him from leaving too soon. He looked toward Lord Kensei's distant stronghold through a drift of mist that thinned and thickened with the breath of the weather. Behind him lay years of war the mountain did not need to hear about. Before him lay rooms and duties and faces that would require his attention when attention was ready. Between them, there was this, the gentle hour when return is only the shape of a man at rest above a valley made softer by rain. The descent from the ridge was unhurried, a soft unwinding of height into level ground, the rain a steady companion that did not need to prove itself. Takeshi followed the slope with the measured patience he had carried up the mountain, placing each step into mud that yielded and then forgot him, crossing small runnels that found their way toward the river with a silver insistence that had nothing to do with speed. The stronghold waited across the low fields like a thought that has held its shape for years. The walls were gray, and even in the rain, the gates blackened and sound, the banners along the parapet hanging in mild resignation, their colors washed into deeper quiet. When he reached the causeway that rose above the last flooded ditch, he paused once more beneath the long eaves of the outer gate, allowing water to shed from hat and cloak before he lifted his eyes. The wood of the gate smelled of age held clean. Smoke and sun baked into grain that had learned not to warp, iron studs set in regular lines that made a calm pattern of endurance. A guard leaned his spear against the post and bowed with the soft scrape of wet heels on stone. Another drew the bar out from its cradle, the weight speaking through the beam as a slow softness, not a clatter. No words were required. It was enough that a familiar presence moved through a familiar ritual. When he stepped under the lintel, the rain became a narrower thread, and then a scatter of small drops from the drip line, and then merely a sound behind him, like the beginning of a memory. Within the walls, the courtyard lay wide and orderly, sand darkening in the rain, stones set for feet to follow when weather made the ground hesitant, low shrubs trimmed and quietly green even under cloud. Water ran off the roof in tidy chains that guided each drop into waiting basins, the surface of each basin a circular conversation that never raised its voice. From a long shed came the soft breath of horses and the warm smell of hay, whose sweetness the rain could not wash away. From the kitchens, a thread of steam wandered, carrying the faint promise of rice and broth, and then the thread was lost in a turn of wind. The stronghold was awake and at work in the manner of a place that chooses to be predictable, the comfort of tasks done, well enough to be invisible. He left his sandals at the threshold of the inner gallery and stepped up onto polished planks that greeted his weight with a cool acceptance. Wet cloth uncurled from his shoulders, and a quiet-handed attendant drew it away to hang and drip beneath the eaves. The hall beyond was long and low, built with a discretion that preferred order to display. Cedar beams ran at measured intervals, their edges planed to a softness that invited touch. The smell of the wood was calm and dry beneath the tide of wet air, a scent like the well-kept memory of summer. Paper doors stood closed where privacy was needed and open where the day should. Pass. Their lattice cast pale grits upon the floor when a lantern moved, patterns that swayed and settled as gently as thought. Footsteps in such a place became part of the place. His own tread was the low hush of skin on wood, the weight distributed. By habit, the full heel only rarely accepted. From farther down the corridor came the light drumming of a boy running an errand who remembered just in time to slow. The boy's breath settled into the quiet without apology. The rain's voice persisted through the roofs and down the water chains, 1,000 small agreements turning to one soft sentence. Somewhere a brazier ticked as a coal shifted, and the smell of charcoal clean rather than sharp stroked air with a warmth that asked nothing but attention. Retainer in plain cloth bowed and led him through a series of turnings that could have been a labyrinth, but felt instead like a lesson in calm. Each turn offered the sight of another lantern and the sound of another drop of water, another scroll hanging with a brushstroke that never quite repeated, another alcove with a plain vase holding a single wet stem. The floor changed once from wood to tatami, and his steps changed with it, softened by the woven rush, the texture friendly beneath the foot, springing and then settling. Where two mats met, the seam ran straight as a roll, and the sight of that straightness, held even after years of feet and furniture, satisfied a hunger he had not realized was in him. In the garden court at the heart of the stronghold, rain traced. Lines through gravel raked into slow waves, the pattern still evident beneath the melt, the intention surviving like the framework of a song after the melody fades. A low maple stood there, its leaves dark and glossy, each holding a bead at the tip that gathered for a long time and then released. A tiny ceremony repeated across branches. Water fell from a bamboo spout into a shallow stone basin with a sound that seemed to behold itself and approve. The retainer halted for a breath to let the rhythm complete, and then moved on. The smell of ink grew stronger as they reached the Hall of Pine. It was not a heavy scent, but it announced itself like a thoughtful guest: stone, water, soot, and the quiet oil of brush hair. The doors stood open, and the room beyond accepted them with a stable light. Lanterns steady as small moons, and the rain's gray diffusing into a shade that made edges gentle. At the far end, Lord Kensei sat behind a low writing table. Posture particular and unarguable, the fall of his sleeve a precise line. His presence did not require introduction. The room had already introduced him by being as it was. Takeshi bowed and waited in the bow long enough for breath to leave and return. Words were not a formality he needed, and the Lord did not summon them. Kensei set down his brush and turned the long, flat paper to dry where the ink would not smudge, his hand moving without haste, the fingertip clean because the work had been exact. His face was the quiet of stone that has decided not to crack. His eyes, when they lifted, registered a change in the room and then filed it among constants. "You have returned," he said, the line simple and sufficient. "I have," Takeshi answered, the voice little more than presence. Silence settled again, a soft cloth placed over a table so it can receive what comes next. The brazier breathed. A faint draft found the lantern near the door and bent its flame to a low angle before conceding and letting it stand again. The ink scent and the cedar scent composed themselves into a harmony that the room had perfected over many years. Nothing tugged at the edges. It was a kind of peace. On a side shelf, set with care at a respectful height, stood a small wooden tablet with a name brushed upon it in the upright hand of the household scribe. The strokes restrained, the ink not glossy, with newness but not yet sun-faded. Before the tablet, a bowl for ash held the pale record of recent offerings, raked smooth in shallow waves. A stick of incense burned there, thin smoke rising and then folding on itself where the roof's breath guided it. And the smell was the lightest ribbon bitter, sweet, simple, exact. The sight of the tablet required no comment. Takeshi bowed toward it in the same manner he had bowed to the living Lord, and the bow, being the same, made no confusion between forms of respect. A figure waited in the soft edge of the room, where lantern light met the patient gray of outdoors. Dago, the advisor whose patience had long ago learned how to be mistaken for kindness. His robe was plain but finely kept, sleeves drawn slightly forward as those sheltering hands that preferred thoughts to tasks. When Kensei's eyes returned to the paper, Dago moved one measured step into clearer light and offered the kind of smile that was less an expression than an arrangement. "Takeshi," he said, the name almost a breeze. "Welcome home." The word home did not touch anything in Takeshi that could be stirred by such a touch. It floated for a breath and then lay down. He inclined his head, the movement as small as the word had been. If there were sharpness in the advisor's greeting, it hid itself well, covered by distant weather, by the soft ceremonial quiet of the hall, by the shared acceptance that a man returning from years of war required only as much sound as he wanted. Kensei spoke again, voice unforced. "There will be time to speak of the roads." "There will," Takeshi answered. The pause after those 4 words, 2 and 2, felt like the kind of pause in which a room measures the number of breaths between things. Not to count them, but to confirm that counting is possible. In that pause, A thought that had visited Takeshi during the last winter returned as lightly as snow on a pine bough. That leadership is often the art of keeping weight quiet. The Lord's quiet had weight. The hall held it without complaint. The retainer withdrew as softly as he had come, and the space behind Takeshi opened. Rain continued at the edges of the world. A messenger in damp sleeves slipped past the door to kneel in the corridor, head bowed, waiting for the hour when his message would be needed. Someone in a deeper room coughed once, decorous, and then did not cough again. In such a place, even minor sounds carried themselves as if they had rehearsed. Dago turned his face a fraction toward the memorial tablet, and his eyes lingered. The pause was natural, the angle respectful, the length perhaps a breath longer than necessary, though only a man who had watched such gestures for many seasons would notice such a breadth. When he turned back, his regard rested briefly on the crease of red cloth tied below the guard of Takeshi's short blade, a plain knot, carefully made, imperceptibly frayed where rain had done its patient work. The gaze was not fixed enough to insult, not casual enough to be innocent. It moved on, but it left behind a line that the mind could trace if it wished. "We honor him," Dago said, the statement neither strong nor thin, each in our way. Takeshi inclined his head again, and the words did not need to continue. Honor was a word that in this room meant doing what must be done without asking that the doing be seen. The incense ash confirmed as much. The ash was a perfect pale field, smooth and almost featureless, except for one subtle furrow at the near edge where a stick had been lifted before its life was spent. The line curved just enough to suggest a hand that had changed its mind in the moment of letting go. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it meant only the human reliability of small indecisions. He noticed and then set the noticing down. Kensei's attention returned to the sheet before him. The brush had written orders. Once already that day, the strokes dried matte and dark, measures taken, measures to be taken. The Lord's eyes held the calm of a man who trusts his own restraint more than he trusts quick solutions. He spoke not to fill a space, but to maintain the order from which all other order comes. The northern line has been troublesome, he said, the words delivered like steady steps. The roads complain of empty carts returning where they should return heavy. There are reports of cut cord and missing grain. The weather, too, chooses badly. The weather always chooses itself, Dago murmured, the softness carrying. Then obeying silence, Takeshi listened without adjusting his posture. He saw in the calm summary a contour that did not yet assert itself, a pattern that preferred to be felt through the feet rather than seen on a map. He allowed that preference to remain a preference. There would be days enough to bring it to speech. No one spoke of Kazuo's place in those roads. No one said that trouble had found him where two ridges crossed, and the wind had made visibility its own choice. No one said whose messages had gone and not returned, whose messenger had slept with his horse's head laid on the blanket because the animal refused to place its nose in the wind. No one said what signs had been taken from shrines and carried elsewhere to be read by hands they were not meant for. The room did not encourage that kind of telling. It preferred instead the kind that arranged duty into lists and placed the lists beside names. In such arrangement, there is mercy. It allows grief to continue breathing without being forced into performance. Rest, Kensei said at last. We will speak at dawn. There was nothing in the tone to resist. Takeshi bowed again, the body making the gesture without drawing attention to itself. And as he rose, he felt the slight weight of the hall's air change in the smallest way that air can change, a shift that might have been caused by a door adjusting on its track somewhere, or a shoulder moving inside silk. Dago moved again, courteous, holding his own stillness as if it were a gift to the Lord and a caution to everyone else. He stepped to one side to allow Takeshi to pass, and as they came near, a faint smell of clove lingered in the advisor's sleeve. Or perhaps it was cedar oil, or perhaps it was nothing more than ink remembering a brush. The lingering was the thing. The nose recognized the intention before it could name the scent. Tomorrow, Daigo said, so low it could have been a thought. We are grateful for your steadiness. Gratitude in such small release could have been a compliment. It could also have been the first stitch in a seam meant to hold a man where he could be useful. Takeshi did not argue with either possibility. He let the word set itself down like a leaf on water and drift to the basin's edge. He left the hall, and the corridor accepted him without changing its pace. Lanterns marked the way in measures of amber, sending tremors of light across the paper doors that made the rooms appear to breathe. The timber underfoot spoke in that settled voice old. Houses keep for those who listen long enough, the voice of a place that counts years by winters. He followed the retainer less by sight than by the thread of motion that unspooled from one turning to the next. Each corner offered the same promise, a further corner, a deeper quiet until the motion itself became devotion, a simple and sufficient task that required only the softness of patience. The rooms he passed did not pry at him. One showed, through a left-open panel, a scroll on which a single pine bent toward a slope, brush hairs visible where the ink thinned. Beside it a tray with a tea bowl still warm enough to soften the chill around it. In another, a rack of boughs, leaned in order, wood varnished by years of careful hands, strings loosened against the damp. Where the corridor opened briefly on the training yard, rain mottled the packed earth with a storm's gentle punctuation marks, and wooden swords hung under the eaves, each paired to its mate as if marriage were possible among objects. A page swept water away from a threshold with a straw broom whose sound on wood felt like the closing gesture of a line of calligraphy. The page's eyes lifted for a breath to take in the silhouette of the returning man, not searching for the story, only placing the figure where it belonged. As a chair is placed where a guest might wish to rest, Takeshi's quarters were small and sufficient, as he had expected: a rolled bedding, a stand for his blades, a low chest that smelled faintly of camphor, a window whose paper had been repaired. In one corner, with a patch of paler paper that showed the repair rather than trying to hide it. He laid the short blade on its stand and felt the knot of red cloth brush his fingers, the texture honest beneath the damp. The cloth was not a talisman, it was a fact arranged to be near. Water worked itself out of the hem of his sleeve and touched the floor as 7 small dots that would dry without needing notice. He knelt for a moment and let the posture rest the bones in the way kneeling can when done without ceremony for any eyes but one's own. Beyond the wall, a servant padded past with a tray, the cups upon it making a faint, polite tapping. Farther, yet the slow clack of a loom counted heartbeats in a room where patience made itself visible. The rain continued, softened by the courtyard and the eaves and the paper doors, into a background that wrapped itself around everything. The way low, surf lies beneath the sounds of a shore village at night. In such a sound, the mind discovers a rhythm to inhabit, and habit, when it is clean and good, can be a form of rest. He unrolled the bedding and pressed his palm along its edge to smooth it. The rush of the mat pressed back with its gentle texture. The smell of dried grass lifting and then settling into something like gratitude. He did not lie down. He sat and allowed the day to loosen along the lines of his shoulders and back, the muscles untying their knots with simple permission. The body understood what to do when not instructed to do anything else. Thought did the same. It moved to Kazuo because Kazuo was a road he would always walk without planning to. Memory met him there with the easy dignity of an elder who neither embraces nor refuses. He remembered a winter noon when the sun reached across a snowy yard and found 2 men sitting with their backs to a wall, bowls of hot broth in their hands, steam having a conversation with the air. He remembered an autumn dusk when the horses were brought in early because the wind decided it was wise. He remembered the first time he realized his brother had begun to defer to him in small matters without making a ceremony of the deference. Each remembrance arrived as feather light pressure on the chest. Not a spear, not a claim, only the true weight of love kept simple. He let each pass when it was ready to pass. From the quiet, another kind of awareness began to take its shape. As fog does when the air agrees to hold it, a recognition of small misalignments that might matter or might not, like a line of rake dash too smooth to be natural, a memorial tablet placed at a height that seemed slightly chosen for visitors rather than for genuine use, a greeting that used the word home and then watched too closely for its effect, an advisor's eyes noticing a knot they should not yet have been able to interpret. None of these would have been enough on its own to tug at the thread of trust, but taken together, they made a delicate tension that could be tuned to one tone only by naming it. He did not name it. He allowed the tension to exist and to teach him how to carry it. A retainer came to the threshold and knelt, announcing with a voice that respected walls, "Bath is prepared." Takeshi thanked him with the slight bow and rose. Warmth met him in the bathhouse in a breath that smelled of pinoki and clean water, a steam carefully made and tempered so that the skin would open without haste. He washed the road from his limbs, without letting the washing become a declaration. When he sank into the cedar tub, the slats offered their quiet buoyancy, and the heat unfastened what the mountain had asked him to hold. In that release, he watched the water's surface. The wet drops from his hair made patterns that widened, met the edge, and turned back as a gentler version of themselves. He stayed until the body felt equal to the night. He dressed while still, warm, the cloth settling on him like a promise not to chafe. Night deepened without drama. Lanterns were trimmed and retrimmed, their light taught to last. Rain, content with itself, continued. Somewhere beyond the wall, a monk's bell spoke twice, not to summon, only to register that time had crossed. A threshold. He returned to the corridor and found it the same corridor as before, but the lanterns lower, the air a shade heavier with rest. The floor held the day's record in 100 scuffs and polished them into sameness, until morning. On his way back toward the Hall of Pine, where he had been asked to stand again at dawn, he passed a small side shrine tucked beneath a beam. The kind that receives confidences from those without offices, the kind that remembers better than it requires. A folded paper lay in the offering bowl, modest among coins and seed. He did not touch it. The restraint was not a matter of fear. It was an old agreement with the world, that not everything which could be known should be known at once. He bowed, and let the shrine continue to keep what it had been given at a turn, where the corridor widened to give space for the unfolding of a screen. He felt that slight change in air again, less a draft than the knowledge that someone had come to share. A piece of space. Dago stood 3 mat lengths away, just inside the penumbra of a lantern whose light chose what to include and what to let go. He was not in the way. He appeared not to be waiting. His eyes, however, did not rush from what they had selected. They held with an attention a little too even, as if the act of seeing carried a purpose that would reveal itself only over hours and days. Tomorrow, Dago repeated, as if the word itself were a balm for the distance between this moment and the next. We will have clearer weather. Perhaps, Takeshi said, which was the only answer weather ever deserved. The advisor's gaze drifted then to the outer darkness, to where rain threaded through the eaves and into the garden, and then, precisely as before, returned and lingered, in that small way that made stillness feel not quite weightless. He bowed, gut exact, and withdrew so softly that the quiet seemed to continue even after he was gone. The lingering remained the eyes, the word home, the furrow in ash, the memorial set high, the patience of ink. None of it could yet be called by the name suspicion in a place that asked for kindness and naming, and yet the chest understood it as a careful burden, one that did not capture the breath but sat across it, reminding the body to breathe more slowly. Takeshi resumed his path. The corridor's long measure held him like a river holds a leaf that knows how not to resist. Lanterns gave way one by one to the rooms they faced, and the rain resumed its old conversation at the edges, 1,000 small hands patting the world toward sleep. As he walked, the stronghold deepened around him, room after room in which people attended to last tasks with minds already half at rest. Storage places with their careful dark, mats shaken and set again in their alignments, inkstones rinsed and dried, brushes sighed back into their sleeves. The closer he came to his room, the more the house felt like a single body deciding, without argument, to lie down. He slid his door aside and entered the modest square of his own night. The bedding had absorbed his earlier touch and was ready to accept more of him. He set his blades on their stand with the familiarity of an act that reminds a man who he is without asking whether he still agrees. He loosened the knot of red cloth and retied it in the same way, fingers remembering the top motion without needing eyes. The knot sat properly. His breath slowed until it matched the rain's calm arithmetic. When he lay down, the mat gave back the day's last store of warmth. He did not chase sleep. He let it approach from the corners with the same patience he had given to the road, to the hall, to the water. In the gentleness between waking and the next thing, a shape stood a little too long at the boundary of thought, the courteous bend of an advisor's head, and the attention that did not close when politeness said it should. It faded only slowly, not like a danger that insists, but like a guest who does not quite know when to depart. The house settled. The rain never stopped, only softened to something like listening. In that listening, the sense of a knot began to form, not tightened, not pulled, simply present. And Takeshi, understanding that knots require the right direction to loosen, did the one thing the hour asked of him. He carried it quietly into sleep. The stronghold around him breathed with the measured comfort of cedar and ink and old tatami and distant lantern light. And yet within that comfort, there was a small, unwavering thread that did not belong to comfort. He felt it without naming it. He allowed it to remain dot. By the time dawn would find the hall of pine, the floors would have cooled to a morning clarity, and the inkstone would have been prepared with water as calm as a kept promise. For now, he lay as still as a stone in a river, and the river went about its work. Somewhere under the eaves, a lantern guttered and recovered. Somewhere in the corridor, Dago's eyes had already closed and then opened again, counting what only he chose to count. In the last easy moment before sleep, Takeshi saw the quiet pattern of the stronghold's rooms extend before him like a path through a garden at dusk turning, measured without haste, and he walked deeper into that pattern, bearing in silence the soft weight of suspicion that had learned within these walls how to be as quiet as rain. Night arrived without fanfare, folding its cool cloth over roofs and courtyards until every sound learned to speak more softly. The stronghold, which by day guided itself with measured footsteps and familiar errands, slowed into a steady breathing. Lanterns drawn down to small, patient embers, corridors smoothing their voices until wood and paper could listen to the rain. Takeshi woke before the bell would have asked him, not startled and not restless, but with a sense that the air itself wished to be crossed, the way a path wishes for a heel after long rain. He rose, set his palm to the tatami to feel its dry. Kindness retied the small red knot below his short blades guard as habit and remembrance in the same motion, and slid his door just enough to pass. The corridor met him with a muted glow. A lantern hung at every second beam, their light paired to a calm oval that did not trouble the edges. The smell of cedar lingered from earlier heat, now cooled, mingling with the faintest gust of ink washed from a stone and set aside to dry. Farther on, a sleeping draft steadied the house, the almost sound of mats easing, the gentle argument of a water chain leading rain to a stone basin, the low consent of beams adjusting to the night's damp. He moved with that ease, each footfall sifting its own weight before being accepted by the floor, the blade at his side a line of metal that had learned how to rest. He found the postern by remembering, not by looking, a narrower door set under, an eave where the outer corridor bent back on itself, a place whose quiet was not secrecy but courtesy to the late hour. A guard in a short cloak bowed with his eyes lowered. The bar was lifted without scrape, the door unlatched without complaint. Cold air entered like an understanding, cool and clean with the breath of wet pine and river stone, a hint of smoke from a cottage beyond the walls, and the very lightest thread of incense that had attached itself somewhere and refused to leave, outside. The rain was not the full-bellied insistence of afternoon, but a fine, continuous fall, as if the night had combed it into order. It drifted more than it dropped, shivering in the lanterns, making the ground shine in small places and darken in others, softening the edges of every shape until nothing could be mistaken for a shout. The world was reduced to things that accepted being touched, the slope of a tile, the shoulder of a stone, the wrist of a branch. Underfoot, the packed earth held true with a moist give that respected careful steps. A lantern at the postern swayed once in a polite wind and then steadied, its wick trimmed to last until first light, its flame the color of tea. He walked the border of the wall for a time without counting it, and the wall returned the favor by requiring no count. Water ran from the gutter in tidy chains, each link beaded with small globes that gathered, swelled, let go. The sound they made in the waiting basins was a thoughtful ticking, not urgent enough to be a measure and not careless enough to be forgettable. In the garden, just within the outer walkway, leaves held their own small mouths of water and released them when they were ready. The stronghold continued to sleep around him, and his presence did not wake it dot beyond the curve of the eastern parapet, where the wall gave way to a low copse and a path that had existed a century before the gate and would exist a century after. There stood a shrine. It was not grand, a roof like a folded hand, pillars worn by time's respectful palm, a shallow step with a dip where feet had thought in and out of their lives. The offering shelf had gathered drops that made a line and then stopped making it, and above the shelf, a tiny bell under its own eave did not ask to be rung. A single lantern hung from a beam. Its light was modest and useful, colored by paper that had taken on the weather's patience, and when the wind found it, the lantern answered by breathing, not by complaint. Incense smoked near the base of the shrine in a stick that was almost finished, its ash leaning but not yet falling, a pale spine against the dark. The fragrance was the faintest bittersweet, a clean whisper that made the damp air taste deliberate. He stepped forward and bowed his head, not because any pair of eyes watched for that sign, but because a man at a border owes himself one small agreement with the world. The rain made a veil between him and the trees beyond, dabbling their trunks with silver, cutting the night into distances a man could accept without wanting to own them. She was already there, which, like the lanterns, steadiness felt as if it belonged. Saori knelt with her robe's hem quietly taking on the rain, hands resting on her thighs with the evenness of one who trusts the ground. Her hair was pinned with a single dark stick, the kind a woman chooses when she has chosen not to choose. Display. Her head was inclined a little toward the offering shelf, and the angle of that inclination carried attention without hunger. The scent of the incense lived near her as if it were a friend, and the soft brush of wet fabric when she shifted her weight was the only sound she allowed the night to notice. He did not speak, and the quiet did not mind. A long breath arranged itself in the space between them, and then another. The lantern moved once and showed the faint brightness along the line of her cheek. The small glimmer that rain draws from skin, then calmed again. She lifted her gaze to him as if lifting a cup, not abruptly and not with show. Only the way one brings something into a better light to see it as it is. Night carries what day refuses, she said, voice made of linen and rain. The words touched their place and lay down. He let them lie. Another length of silence settled, not empty but well made, stitched by water and faint ash. In that quiet, he felt how the hall had smelled of cedar and ink, how Dago's eyes had lingered just longer than politeness, how a memorial tablet had been set at a height meant to be seen, how line and ash had curved as if a hand had retraced. A decision. None of these rose like alarms. They worked like the slow pressure of a stream against a stone, teaching it without argument. She set a folded paper on the offering shelf, not as a gift to him, not as a secret, simply as something to be where it belonged. The paper took on the damp at its corners and accepted it. Beneath the eave, the tiny bell stirred and stilled. Do not chase the shadow that chases you. Sayori murmured. He stood a little to the side so that the lantern did not place him right in the middle of itself. Rain found the brim of his hat and let go, found his face and did the same. The droplets cold and precise at first, and then warming as the skin understood them. The sword at his hip rested as if it were listening. A knot pulled in anger makes a noose, she said, barely above breath. Pulled in patience, it loosens. His memory went to a winter road and a strap that had stiffened, to a hand that had worn the leather and tried again. The road had not rewarded the first attempt because the hand had wanted too much from it. The second attempt had required only the heat of breath and a bit of time. What she said did not surprise him. The surprise, if there was any, was that the night had brought the thought here to be shared. Beware the hand that warms itself at a hidden fire. The lantern shifted then, a small swing on a light chain, and the flame inside leaned against its paper wall before finding its straightness again. The rain answered with a faint quickening, a sprinkle that passed in one place and not another. He remembered Dago's scent clove or cedar oil, or something ink-soft, and how it had continued after the man had gone in a way that smells seldom continue without choice. The burning crane, she said, but 2 words laid down with care. Flies without ash. A crane in his mind was a stroke on a banner and the white body of a bird that could disappear into fog while still touching water with 1 foot. He had seen such birds stand in winter creeks and pretend the cold did not belong to them. He had seen their black-tipped wings push against emptiness until emptiness accepted them. Burning, however, belonged to other things: pine splinters, torches lined along a wall, the sudden gold of a thatch caught at its edge, the careful heat of a brazier. A burning crane was not a thing that belonged to the world as he had met it. The phrase entered like a folded slip and opened inside the chest. When paper learns to be flame, she breathed, stone learns to speak. He thought of shrines at field corners, of messages hidden where a root pressed against foundation, of a writer who pried at a crack with a patient blade. He thought of the red dot of seal wax that used to mark a lord's attention, and how in rain such a dot would blur and run and be only another stain unless someone had planned for the weather first. He thought of Dago's measured step into a room and how his words always arrived already wrapped. Your brother left a thread, she said. Follow it with closed mouth, open eyes. Kazua's thread was not cloth or cord. It was the habit of a mind that taught by example and the small choices a man makes when no one sees. Takeshi felt not a tightening, but a straightening under the advice, as if the spine remembered something it had wanted to remember anyway. He did not bow because He did not wish to turn the moment into something it did not need to be. The moment understood and remained what it was. Loyalty is a vessel, Sayori continued, and a line of smoke from the last of the incense uncurled between them and became its own thought. Fill it wrongly, and it leaks. He had known a captain who filled loyalty with applause and then wondered why it evaporated, and another who filled it with fear and wondered why it turned sour. The best vessels he had seen were the ones no one celebrated, the ones that simply carried water where water should go. He kept those images where the advice could find them later. Silence is a blade, she said, unsheathed only to save breath. The night made a small agreement with that line. The rain thickened for 3 breaths and then let itself thin. Again, as if to show what silence can do when it chooses to be proof and not shield. He felt, almost with amusement, that the sword at his hip approved. Not because it liked being compared, but because it enjoyed being understood in any form. He looked once at the folded paper on the shelf and then away. The urge to open it was not curiosity so much as a craftsman's wish to see whether a joint had been made cleanly. He let the wish pass over him and into the ground through his feet. What needed to be read tonight would be read by the air in any case. When the crane burns on paper, Sayori said softly, watch who warms his hands. The lantern breathed again and showed the hint of a pattern worked into the paper shade, a simple line that, in the movement of flame, suggested a wing without insisting upon it. He felt a small, almost private shiver move through the air, the kind that comes when a thought finds the shape it wants and sits there without ceremony. The test comes in a whisper, she said, not a shout. No further words followed. She lowered her hands to the matting, pressed the heels of her palms to it as if confirming that it still held, then rose with the unhurried economy of one who does not throw any weight away. The rain agreed to lay itself gently on her sleeves and on the knot of her hairpin. She bowed toward the shrine, a bow so shallow and precise that it seemed to correct nothing and acknowledge everything, then turned into the night with 3 steps that produced only the sound of wet cloth choosing where to touch itself. Past the edge of the lantern's reach, she was not swallowed. She was permitted to leave. Takeshi remained, letting the place fill him so that he would not carry away any more than he should. The offering shelf held the paper, which did not change. The bell kept its counsel. The incense had finished and left a white length that would tilt and fall when the next air asked it to. The rain resumed the story it had been telling since evening. He did not try to assemble the phrases she had offered into a picture. He let them arrange themselves against the walls of his attention as the night saw fit. A few lines taking their places quietly and a few choosing to stand aside for now. When he turned back toward the postern, the fortress felt larger than before, not because it had grown, but because its spaces had revealed their decision to hold more than sleep. Lanterns along the walk glowed with an even pulse. Water found the basins and made its precise sound. A fox crossed the path at a respectful distance, wet paws leading for commas and a pause. Somewhere in the house, a late-watch guard shifted, his weight from one leg to the other, a small kindness to a knee. Beyond that, the world simplified to cedar, paper, rain, and the thought he carried as lightly as he could. Inside the door, the guard replaced the bar with a seriousness too soft to be called solemn. Takeshi returned his nod. The corridor welcomed him back in the same tone it had used when he left. As he walked, the memory of Dago's regard found its way into the rhythm of his steps, a presence not heavy enough to slow him and not light enough to ignore. It was not fear and not anger. It was the weight of something that preferred not to be named yet. He accepted it the way one accepts a small stone in a pocket to remember a crossing dot in his room. The bedding still held the warmth he had given it and returned it with interest. He set his hand on the short blade stand and found the knot's texture again, that exact roughness where thread parted into itself. He closed his eyes and let the advice of the shrine travel along the line of breath and settle there. Burning crane, the hidden fire, the vessel of loyalty, the blade of silence, the whisper that comes as test. He did not ask for understanding. He waited as one waits for tea to settle, knowing that drinking too soon leaves grit on the tongue. Outside, the lantern at the shrine swayed in a wind that did not trouble the walls, and the flame inside continued with its small work. The night kept its balance. Somewhere, whoever kept the memorial ash would wake earlier than custom and smooth the field before others arrived to see it. Somewhere, a paper would be moved from one place to another without hands being seen. Somewhere, a man who had learned to warm himself without a brazier would close his eyes for an hour and count a kind of number. No clock keeps. Takeshi lay down and listened until listening became the simplest thing, until the rain and the breath agreed upon a tempo and the house eased its bones under him. The words that had been spoken did not go away. They softened and found their places like water seeking a slot in rock. When sleep came, it did not erase them. It kept them safe among the quiet shapes of the stronghold's rooms. In the last clear edge of waking, the image that remained was not a face and not a hand, but the suggestion of a bird drawn in charcoal, wings opened. Head lifted, a hint of flame without smoke held over paper that had learned to be more than paper. He felt, deep in the part of him that trusted slow counsel, that his path would test both his loyalty and his silence, and the knowledge was not a burden, but a guide to the weight he must carry well. Sayori was gone into the night, and the night was kind enough to hold her. The stronghold slept in its careful lines. The rain, untroubled, kept to its work. A quiet, uneasy stillness settled like a second blanket soft, not smothering, reminding him that something important had been said, and that, for now, not knowing entirely was the respectful way to honor it. Night had settled into its gentlest work, smoothing corners, dimming color to a soft accord, letting the rain keep time for those who were still awake. The stronghold slept in ordered layers, rooms within rooms, courtyards within walls, each one breathing slowly under cedar and tile. In the hour when lantern wicks are trimmed and set to last, Takeshi rose from the mat as quietly as steam rising from a bowl and slid his door open with the care one gives to a sleeping house. The rain had lightened to a fine sift, almost a thought. More than weather, a thin silver between roof and earth. The corridor offered its measured glow. Paper panels held small ovals of light that did not insist, the scent of cooled cedar lingering beneath the faintest memory of ink. Beyond the postern, the air was clean and damp, washed back to plainness by the evening's long rain. He stepped out and let the eaves release a line of droplets across his sleeve before he moved into the open. The ground answered with a soft give under his solace, a good weight that acknowledged each footfall without complaint. Somewhere a bamboo spout tapped its basin at intervals, the hollow note patient and unhurried. He did not go far. The path that ran along the inner wall curved toward a stand of bamboo that had been left to grow as wind's instrument and shade for summer afternoons. Tonight the leaves were beads of water that shivered and fell in tiny flurries when the lightest breeze returned from the river. The smell of earth was tender and true after the rain, dark, clean, a little sweet where moss gathered on stone. The world held its quiet. The quiet held its shape. He sensed the approach before he heard it, the way a practice yard can feel a late student reaching the gate. Then faintly, the rhythm of steps that wanted to be noiseless but had not yet learned the last economies. The exhale caught too high in the chest. The careful placing of a foot a hair too near the board seam. The quick correction that made the next step almost soundless. A young presence, earnest in its modesty, Nobu stepped into the lantern's tempered circle and bowed low, rain glinting along the line of his jaw. His hair was still damp from the earlier shower, his robe clean but unpretending. the cord at his wrist a little frayed where a nervous habit had worried it smooth. The blade at his hip was new enough to gleam even in this soft light, the wrapping too regular, the fitting still shy of the first neck. He kept his gaze respectful, the eyes of someone who watches a fire's edge rather than the flame. "Permit me to serve you," he said, the words not thrown but placed. "If there is a day or a road you will walk, let me walk behind." Takeshi let the night sit with the sentence. Bamboo leaves rubbed against one another in a gentle way, like the sound of distant cloth. The rain made a fine hiss through the grove and then disappeared into the ground. As simple as breath leaving a body. "Stand," he said, and the word was not a test. "Speak plainly." Nobu lifted his head. "I can carry, watch, learn," he answered. "I know little and want to learn rightly." "I will do as you say." Takeshi took in the set of the boy's shoulders, the earnest straightness that had not yet met a winter of doubt, the new weight of the sword that had not yet taught the hips how to move with it. He remembered an earlier yard under a different rain, another young man making a vow with that same unbruised gravity. A memory of Kazuo's hand, steady on his shoulder, arrived without ache. Simple as a lantern brought into a darker room. "Loyalty is carried, not worn," Takeshi said. "If you carry it, let it be for the clan first. And if you serve with me, keep your breath low and your steps lower." Nobu bowed again, deeper, the movement fluent because humility had been practiced as carefully as sword work. "I understand." "Then begin by standing still," Takeshi said. "Listen until the grove tells you how to move." They remained beneath the bamboo. The leaves made their steady whisper. The rain softened their whisper to a hush. A moth visited the lantern and considered its warmth without burning itself. The faint resin of wet wood came and went, threaded by the clearer note of damp earth. Takeshi let the young man's breath find a quieter home in his body. Watched the shoulders drop a finger's breadth, the belly make room for a longer draw of air. He shifted his own stance a fraction, and the ground gave him back his weight. With its familiar composure, "Your blade," he said after a time. "Let it breathe." Nobu's hand went to the hilt and rested there. The sword remained sheathed. The skin of the scabbard was cool and slightly rough where lacquer had learned. The world. When Takeshi drew his short blade a finger's width to clean the mouth of the scabbard with rain, the old habit made almost no sound. The weight of a sword unsheathed in silence has its own gravity. Even the night takes notice. "Hold here," Takeshi said, touching the boy's elbow lightly. "Let the wrist be a hinge, not a fist. When you step, let the earth agree first." "Yes," Nobu breathed. They practiced not with blows, but with postures and corrections, with the soft scrape of sandals on damp plank, with the quiet geometry of bodies learning how to be simple. Takeshi's words were few and careful, low, quieter, less shoulder. The bamboo answered each adjustment with another sigh, and the rain underlined each lesson without hurry. Somewhere, a night bird called once and changed its mind. The lantern's flame bent when a breeze found it, and then stood again, its color deepening toward amber, the wick a small, steady spine. The world seemed to accept the vow being made, not as a ceremony, but as a useful shape added to the hour. When the wind shifted, it brought a different thread through the grove, a breath of clove, faint and misplaced, the kind of scent that clings to sleeves used to resting near ink. It slid past like a memory and disappeared, but the disappearance had the carefulness of a foot that does not wish to be counted. Takeshi's body noticed before his name for it could form. He stilled his hand on the hilt and let his attention. "Lift in the way a horse lifts an ear," again, he said. As if nothing had changed, Nobu settled into the posture they had just corrected. The boy's breath, steadier now, drew the air into him with a neatness he had not possessed an hour earlier. Takeshi stepped a half-pace to the side and let the grove speak to him plainly. Wet leaf against wet leaf. the occasional pat of a drop, falling, a faint, deliberate weight where no branch moved. Shadows arranged themselves among the stems, respectful of the night's rules, men who had learned to share their weight across feet until even mud forgot them. Their faces were wrapped in cloth dark enough to turn a head into a shape, their hands gloved, blades worn low to prevent a flash. They moved well and did not smell of fear. A careful craft hired to be careful. The young man's vow tightened not as alarm, but as a thread, newly tied and tested. Takeshi positioned himself so that the lantern was at his back and the bamboo to his left, the wall a measured distance to the right. The ground beneath his sandals knew him and would not surprise him. The grove in front concealed and revealed. In equal measure, he raised his hand in the smallest of signals. Nobu shifted his foot a thumb's width and let his weight sink. The boy's eyes did not widen. There was discipline already in him, the shape of a man who wished to honor his own word. The first assailant appeared as rain gathers on a leaf, not suddenly, but all at once. A short blade slid from cloth in a thin line of dark, carried low, seeking the line between hip and guard. Takeshi stepped into it the way one steps under an eave to avoid the heavy part of a downpour. His short sword left its scabbard with that silent weight, a single clean draw that made more room in the night than sound. Steel met steel in a muted kiss, not a clang, the kind of meeting that resolves a question without summoning the house. He turned the man's wrist in a small circle and let the circle close itself, the blade pointing now at the earth that welcomed it. The assailant fell with his breath still in his chest, astonished to discover such an economy. Two more came, one splitting to the side toward the boy, one testing the higher angle as if measuring an eave for a larger rain. Takeshi's world narrowed to simple measures, a step, a pivot, a shoulder closed just enough to ask a blade to pass where it could not. Nobu's blade left its sheath with a soft cry, too bright by a hair. The young man caught the edge of a short staff, felt the jar up his arm, recalibrated his grip, and did not take a step he did not need. Breathe, Takeshi said, and the word carried through the rain like a stone dropped into a pool. Left, Nobu lowered his shoulder and let the cut pass where his head had just been, then struck the staff near the hand that held it. Wood spoke quietly and then spoke no more. The boy's next step was better weight down, hips aligned, point on its own thought. He moved without feeling clever. The grove approved with another set of whispers. More shadows became men. Two tried to slip past toward the house, then thought better of it when the lantern behind Takeshi declared their outline too honestly. Another approached with a hook meant for ankles. Another hung back to read the fight and learn its names. They were not amateurs, nor were they dreamers. Their purpose had been spoken to them in a warm room by a voice that knew how to ask without asking. Rain darkened cloth and hair, and the earth where knees met it. In the damp, a blade can stick in its scabbard or slide too eagerly. Takeshi's hands remembered such mistakes from other nights and refused them now. He kept his elbows narrow, his cuts small, letting the assailants bring their own haste to his economy. Twice, he merely moved aside and let a man arrive at a bamboo stalk with all the intention he had meant for a body. The stalk flexed and returned to its place with the mild reproof of something that does not hold grudges. Lo, he called softly, and Nobu obeyed, letting a blade sing through air where he was not, then answering with a thrust that did not pretend to be more than it was. The boy's courage was clean. It did not seek to be brilliant, only sufficient. His inexperience showed not in panic, but in an extra motion. The way a sentence adds an unnecessary word before the mouth learns the line of better speech. Takeshi closed the space such motions invite, covering the edge of the boy's mistake with a turn that looked like weather adjusting direction. A masked man came in close with a knife reversed. Head low, shoulders set for a rush. Takeshi gave him a sleeve and then a forearm, turning just enough for the knife to find cloth and not what cloth protects, then sent the man past with a pressure that suggested he had misread a door. The knife struck earth. The man's breath left him and did not return quickly. Over the short fence at the grove's far edge, two more shapes hesitated, remembering perhaps that the job had not included dying for anyone's coin. One of them, slimmer than the others, took a step as if to test the bargain, then checked. The lantern's flame trembled again. The wind shifted. The clove thread returned and went, as if it had been an afterthought tied to the tail of a thought. Takeshi moved between the boy and that scent without, announcing the preference. The long moment of the skirmish spread itself across the grove, and then, like rain thinning at last, it began to end. Men on one knee stayed there, having learned something about the limits of purchase. Men with staffs found themselves unstaffed. Men with knives discovered their wrists preferred not to be persuaded further. One ran, polite in his panic, trying not to break more bamboo than necessary. Another backed away with the dignity of someone who had not yet fallen and wished to keep that modest victory. The last one, older, a technician, made a precise cut. That would have opened a lesser guard. Takeshi answered with a pressure from the shoulder that turned the cut into a line traced on water. The older man read the night correctly, inclined his head to the extent his pride allowed, and disappeared into the indistinctness where rain makes everything one thing. Silence returned almost exactly as it had stood before, surprised to find it had been interrupted. The bamboo resumed its rubbing, leaf against leaf, as if continuing a conversation that had only paused. The earth released a deeper sweetness after being pressed, a smell like the inside of old bark. The lantern made its soft sound at the wick and steadied. Nobu stood with the blade low and his breath beginning to find its rest. His eyes were clear. His hands shook 1 degree, then quieted. He did not look for praise, which was its own praise. Your courage is strong, Takeshi said, voice at the level of the leaves. Let your feet be quieter than your courage. Nobu bowed, the bow smaller than before, the humility of someone who has met a part of himself he had hoped to meet and found it worth keeping. Yes, he answered, and the word did not try to be more. They did not count the men. Counting would have asked for a meaning the hour did not yet wish to give. Takeshi knelt by one who had fallen nearest the lantern and turned the cloth at the man's throat with 2 fingers. No cross, no name, nothing a household could object to. Only a small stitch on the inner seam, a thread darker than the rest, worked into a shape that might have been a wing if seen from the right angle. Chart at the knot as if a coal had kissed it once and been taken away. On the man's forearm, under the wet sleeve, a patch of linen bore a faint mark. Not ink, something burned into the weave and then allowed to fade. A crane no larger than a thumb joint, smudged where heat had not been even. No ash remained. The cloth had learned the memory of fire and kept it. He let the sleeve fall back. The rain chose that moment to thin again, a brief mercy. Somewhere a guard on the wall coughed softly and made the cough sound like a man clearing his throat before. Sleep. The world wished to return to the dream of a quiet night. Nobu wiped his blade with the care of someone taught to respect endings. The cloth caught a small line of water and drew it back into itself. He sheathed with 2 hands, the mouth of the scabbard receiving steel without protest. The sound, the small, correct note of finish floated a breath and was gone. Who sent? Them? The boy asked, voice lowered as if not to disturb the bamboo. Men who do not sign their work? Takeshi said. He did not add the name both of them had already learned to keep behind the teeth. The clove thread hovered at the edge of memory. The incense of the shrine earlier in the night folded itself around it. Sori's words found their places again, burning crane, hidden fire, silence as a blade. they moved the fallen a little, deeper into the grove, leaving them arranged in the way one leaves tools in a shed, respectfully without claiming them. A retainer would find them before dawn, and proper acts would follow. It was enough just now to give the house another hour of sleep, to spare the inner rooms the jolt that wakes a child, to keep the nights calm near those who needed it. As they finished, the lantern's light reached a small card half buried. Where a heel had slipped, Takeshi picked it up between two fingers. The paper had been oiled to resist the weather, the edges singed in a manner that suggested design as much as accident. On it, the faintest charcoal outline of a crane's wing, one stroke long, one stroke short, crossing where a seal would sit if a seal had been wanted. No seal marked it. If heat had ever touched that place, it had done so as a whisper. He slid the card into his sleeve and did not comment. The grove breathed. The stronghold beyond resumed its composed rest. A fox called once near the ditch and then chose to keep its counsel. Nobu stood again at the place where he had first vowed and bowed once more, not because the fight required a new vow, but because his earlier words wished to be folded into the hour's new shape. "Let me remain," he said. "Let me learn." "Be quiet. You will walk behind," Takeshi answered. "You will watch without asking to see. You will speak little?" "Yes." They returned along the path in the same tempo with which they had come, the bamboo giving them a final brush as if to mark their shoulders with green. At the postern, the guard lifted the bar with the same soft seriousness as before. The corridor greeted them with its low light and its habit of keeping what it has given Dot in his room. Takeshi set the short blade upon its stand and retied the red cloth that remembered another vow. His fingers paused on the knot a moment longer than necessary, not to hold the past, but to let its weight distribute itself as it should. He drew the oiled card from his sleeve and placed it beside the stand. From that small burned wing, the night seemed to find a new edge. Outside, rain stroked the eaves in long, even lines. The bamboo leaves continued their quiet conversation. A water chain counted the heartbeats of a house that wanted its dawn to arrive still unbroken. Sleep returned to the rooms, but not as fully as before. The betrayal Sayori had whispered toward was moving closer. No longer a rumor carried by weather, but the pressure of footprints in wet soil. Takeshi lay down and listened for a while longer. The young vow in the next room held steady. The grove kept its secrets until day. When his eyes closed, it was not relief but readiness that accompanied him. Readiness tempered to the hour's softness, sharpened by the knowledge that the hidden fire had reached the edge of the walls and would not be satisfied with smoke. Winter arrived as if the night had been busy with quiet work and, by morning, laid a clean page over the province. What had been rain turned to flake and feather. What had been the hush of wet bamboo became the deeper hush of snow bowed on every branch. The stronghold's roofs were soft ridges. Garden stones grew round its shoulders. The water chains were dressed with clear beads that held the breath and fell in measured ticks into basins now rimmed with lace. Footsteps entered the day like new characters written carefully on the white. Takeshi and Nobu passed under the postern at first light, leaving the stronghold's cedar calm to go where winter had polished the world. Their breaths unfurled in pale strands. Their shoulders learned a small new weight as flakes gathered and left, patient as counsel. The air carried the faint metal of cold, clean enough to sharpen thought without asking for haste. Cloth grew crisp at the hem. The cords at their wrists stiffened and then soft again with each flex of hand. Beneath their sandals, snow gave a particular answer, a dry, articulate crunch that could be counted and then forgotten. A rhythm the body settled into without being asked. Fields lay open to the sky, furrows smoothed into simple plains, stubble wearing caps of white as if the earth had grown a short, respectful hair. River reeds leaned together and whispered less. Even the river, not frozen but subdued, pulled its sound inward and ran under a lid of air made weighty by cold. In the hedgerows, sparrows fluffed and tucked and became their own shelters. A solitary kite rode a strip of wind with a tilt of wing that looked like nothing at all and accomplished everything it meant to. The land had agreed to hold its breath, and men moving across it were obliged to move in a manner that did not interrupt. They followed a boundary path where stones marked the line between one farmer's claim and the next. Snow softened the edges of those stones, but the line still held, as lines do when they have been walked for generations. At distances, the low humps of shrines lifted their small roofs against the day. Smoke rose from 3 cottages and bent toward the north. In that, bending the weather spoke of itself without insistence. The cold did not bully. It persuaded. Where the path entered a clutch of pines, the scent of resin returned, dry and high and almost sweet where the sap had sealed last summer's cuts. Needles held snow as if practicing balance. Blades turned into feathers, the weight distributed along a geometry the tree had long understood. The world narrowed to green and white and the soft graphite of bark. Nobu walked a pace behind, his step now quieter in snow than it had been on wet boards, his breath measured, the rectangular bundle at his back riding steady as his resolve. He did not ask where they were going. He followed the way a student follows a brush already wet with ink. Farther out, beyond fields and hedgerows, the signs of older motion appeared, a set of prints that had lost their edges to the first flurry. A patch of ice crisscrossed by hare and fox, a thin iron-gray stain kept by the ground where snow had been laid to cover it. Broken shafts of arrows lay in the ditch, the wood pale where it had split, the feathers soggy and clumped into stern little brushes. A single vambrace rested half-buried beside a stone, its lacquer crazed by frost. When Nobu lifted it, the cold had already taught it to let go of the leather beneath. He set it back in the snow as if returning a guest to his chair. The air here held a faint iron smell that the winter could not quite erase, a memory that did not demand attention but did not release it either. Takeshi stopped without announcing a reason. He stood with the patience winter prefers, letting the first understanding arrive through the solace of his feet, through the straightness of spine, through the stillness of a gaze that did not chase details but receive them. The field ahead was a pale tablet written on and then wiped, traces remaining where ink had been pressed harder into the paper of earth. Here, a shallow depression, no longer a boot print, but the idea of one. There, the snow heaped strangely along. A low ridge pushed, not drifted. At the edge of the copse, a slash of bark newly bright where a blade had tested itself against a pine before someone remembered to be careful. The day was so quiet that even a memory seemed to make a sound. In that soft sound, he felt the nights form a chain behind him, the hush of bamboo, the clove thread passing, the masked men who moved well enough to be paid to move well. The chain linked itself to Sayori's phrases until the words became shapes rather than speech. Hidden fire, burning crane, silence unsheathed only to save breath. Winter had taken those shapes and painted them in white and shadow. He moved forward along the copse's edge, where wind had swept a thin path and the ground offered something firmer than drift. Here, Nobu said softly, not pointing, not stepping ahead, only placing the awareness where it belonged. A patch lay just beyond a small rise, where the snow was not so deep because a stand of young pines had caught most of it. On that patch, things that should not be left were left. A bow with a cracked belly, wrapped at the grip with a strip of fabric that had been red when it was dry and was now the color of brick. A quiver appended, arrows fletched with crow feather half frozen into the surface, their sharpened tips making a field of small, clean dots. A length of rope stiff and quiet with cold. A cloth sachet torn, herbs spilled, and darkening the snow with their own tiny shadows. The cold organized these remnants into a stillness that asked to be respected. Takeshi knelt. The snow brushed his knee and accepted the weight as if it had been waiting. Close to the rope, where the ground dipped a finger's breadth, the surface had a different sheen, less like powder, more like a thin glaze. He set his gloved knuckles to it and felt, even through wool, the smoother pushback of ice. When his breath touched the place, a ghost of the iron smell answered him, faint but sure, the kind that clings to metal and hides in seams. The wind did not carry it away. The wind understood when not to intrude. He lifted the cracked bough, turned it, and set it down again. The grip's cloth stuck a moment and then released, leaving a rectangular ghost of darker red on the palm of his glove. On one end of the bow, near the knock, someone had scratched a tiny mark, a split pine needle crossed by another. Modest, private, the sort of thing a man adds not for glory but to know his own tool among many. The mark touched a chamber in memory he did not open all the way. He moved his hand across the snow until it met something not snow, a resistant curve under a thin cover, smooth and familiar and wrong to find here. He brushed the weight back carefully, not with the hunger of discovery, but with the courtesy paid to something that has waited. A small emblem lay there, lacquer dulled by cold, half embedded where the thaw had been brief days ago and the refreeze had sealed it this morning. A round crest no larger than the breadth of his thumb and forefinger, ink black when dry, now gray with frost. In its face, 3 needles bound with a knot sat inside a ring, his family sign cut with the restraint of a hand that knew the weight of symbols. On the lower curve, a nick had lived for years, tiny, crescent-shaped, the result of a winter. Day when 2 brothers had swapped, jests about clumsiness and then gone silent because the moment was too dear to be worn thin by laughter. The nick was still there. Along the ring's edge, a thin stain had spread and dried long ago. The snow had preserved its memory in brown blood made into quiet. He did not lift it immediately. He allowed his palm to rest near it until the warmth of skin passed through wool and across the thin film of ice. Frost gave a delicate sigh more felt than heard. He took the emblem into his hand, and the cold traveled into him the way a necessary truth travels, without apology, without injury, settling its shape where it must. Beneath the chill, he could feel the faint geometry of the carving, the place where the notch's edges rose and fell, the place where lacquer wore thinner because the thumb had found it often. He knew his brother's habits well enough to know the thumb had been Kazuo's. Nobu did not move. The boy's breath rested low now as practice had taught it, but each exhale lifted a small cloud that drifted toward the pines and gone. He did not ask. There was nothing he could say that would be better than not saying. He stood with his own, hands open at his sides, not in surrender but in a posture that allows a winter day to pass through without knocking anything loose. The cold made silence a cleaner thing. And that cleanness, memories were not sharp and greedy. They were orderly, fragments laid out as a monk lays utensils before a meal. Nothing ornate, nothing accidental. Kazuo swinging into a saddle when dawn saw its first light, and the leather creaked like a door admitting a friend. Kazuo's hair tied with indifferent neatness, a small strand escaping up a nape, the one strand he always forgot. Kazuo squinting into a shifting snow and smiling with half his mouth at the joke winter. Made of men. Kazuo's hand on his shoulder the night they set off to the northern line. The pressure not a command, not even counsel, just agreement between 2 weights. There had been words. There had also been the knowledge that words were unnecessary. Winter taught men to speak without speaking. Kazuo had learned that lesson earlier and better. Saori's voice, which had sounded like linen under a lantern and rain on paper, returned to him from the long hollow of the trees, A knot pulled in anger tightens, silence is a blade. Beware the hand that warms itself at a hidden fire. The burning crane flies without ash. In the white, those lines took on a different presence. Fires in winter are defined by those who stand near them. Ash upon snow tells stories the wind respects too much to tell. A crane in a white world disappears or declares itself. There is almost no middle place. He did not try to make the emblem explain any of it. He let it be what it was proof without. Conclusion. They moved on slowly, following traces not with eagerness but with attention, the way a careful reader follows a line of ink that has been watered by accident. Broken arrowheads led them to a shallow hollow where winter had thrown a sheet over the ground's old convulsions. Here a strap buckled with ice. There a helmet bowl held a thawed pool that had refrozen in a scallop pattern, the wind's handiwork making a border of tiny teeth. Snow had covered most of what the living prefer not to see and the dead no longer mind. The cold had done what the living could not neaten the outline of loss. The faint iron smell a little stronger here, the air thinner with it, but not cruel. A ridge of wind-carved snow shaped a low wall. On its leeward side, near the root of a young pine that still held its small courage under all that weight, a strip of cloth had been trapped and preserved. He brushed it free. It crumbled slightly at the edges where the frost took its proportion. The color, once strong, had dwindled to a patient red, the color winter permits when it means to be honest. Stitching remained at one corner, the precise, even hand of a seamstress who had been taught well and expected no thanks familiar threadwork that had passed through his fingers in other years. Not the sash he wore now, but its sibling. Not the same piece, but the same story. A few hairs lay along one edge, caught when a knot had been released too quickly. Dark, strong, a winter or two younger than the snow. He did not need to hold them to know whose they had been. Wind built and eased with the care of someone turning pages in a treasured book. No page tore, no page was skipped. Trees stood as they had always loved to stand in winter, upright, modest, not making a ceremony. Of endurance. Far across the field, a fox stitched a line between clumps of grass, tail held level, the red made brown by the day's discipline. It paused, turned its head to register their motion with the polite interest of those who expect men to come and go, then resumed its reading of the ground. Shall I mark the place? Nobu asked, the words almost lost in the soft brightness. For now, Takeshi said, and the simplicity of that answer carried all the future needed at this hour. They built a small cairn from stones not completely frozen to the earth. Hands. Learning winter's measure, a single layer, then a second, gaps small enough to hold the idea without pretending to permanence. Snow sifted down and decorated their work as soon as they stepped back, as if to acknowledge and then reclaim. Nobu bowed to the cairn with a minimal incline. The bow met the quality of the day and matched it. They climbed a low knoll to look back. From there, the trail of their steps made a modest line through the field, the pattern changing subtly where the ground's firmness had altered under the thin weight. The stronghold's walls sat far off, soft into patience by distance and weather. Banners were not visible, but he knew where they would be, and he imagined their cloth heavy with frost, their colors sleeping to conserve themselves. Smoke from the kitchens rose straighter now. The hour leaned toward noon, but winter keeps its secrets even then, and the light stayed pale. He stood with the emblem warm now in his glove, not warmer than a small thing can be in such air, but warmer enough to tell him a truth travels both ways. The hand into the emblem into the hand. The stain along its edge had dried in a circle that a summer would have argued with, but winter accepted as a precise account. Without thinking, he touched the notch with his thumb, the way he might touch a bead to count the day. The lacquer was smooth where the notch was not. The difference felt like a kind of blessing, the proof that things made by men and altered by life can still be whole. The quiet deepened inside him. Not the kind that tries to seal grief away, not the kind that presses resolve into a shape too hard for human use. Only the quiet of a man who knows the road ahead will ask for obedience to something larger than wanting. Duty stands taller in winter, when every unnecessary motion reveals itself more quickly, when every breath has a cost the body feels. Revenge, too, loves winter's clarity, its straight lines, its hunger for corrections, but revenge lives alone and eats its own store if not checked. The emblem in his hand refused to be a banner for either. It was simply the true weight of a brother's life reduced to an object that could be carried. A small law he could not appeal. Sayori's prophecy came back to him as the snow comes, back to the same branches all morning. The burning crane, the hidden fire, the vessel of loyalty, the blade of silence, the test that arrives not as a shout but as a whisper. He had heard that whisper in the bamboo. He heard it now in the way the wind paused between trees and the way the cold preserved. A story even when men did not speak it. The choice narrowed itself without drama. One path would put a name to the fire and feed it with the first dry thing he found. The other would keep watch and carry water until the vessels around him were filled correctly. He did not have to choose this hour, but he had to admit he was walking between those boundaries. Nobu stepped close enough for his shoulder to share a degree of heat. Without presumption, the boy's eyes took in the emblem and then returned to the horizon, making himself an extension of Takeshi's attention rather than a demand upon it. He had come through a night of blades to this white day and understood, the way the body does, that winter changes the nature of courage. It becomes quieter, more domestic, made up of patience and the care of small things. He said nothing. But saying would come later, when wood needed to be carried or a message delivered without loss between fingers. They turned back toward the stronghold as the weather asked them to. Snow resumed a little more eagerly, a thicker brush across the page. The path they had made began to soften at the edges and then soften more until their prints became a suggestion rather than a claim. The crunch underfoot kept time for them. Once, in a small hollow where wind had not been able to work, the smell of frozen blood rose up like an old instruction, a brief iron that the nose recognized from even a great distance, then vanished as they climbed. The faint sound of a bell reached them from the walls, flat and polite, the tone winter chooses when it must mark an hour without breaking a dot at the edge of the copse. Takeshi paused again. A single snow-laden branch lowered itself with a slow, inevitable grace and then released its burden a sheet, the white collapsing into an oval dark enough to look like a door. Under that new dark, something glinted, the dull gleam of hammered iron. He brushed snow aside and found the small strap end, the fitting that keeps a sash from fraying, engraved with a wing that might have been a crane's if a man had wanted it to be. The engraving had been burned briefly, as if someone had tested a seal against it, leaving a brown ring where flame had kissed metal and been taken away. No ash. The wing not quite a crane unless a mind made it one. He held the strap end to the emblem for a moment. The two did not belong to each other, but they recognized the same world. He pocketed the strap end. Winter approved, no sound, no comment, only the recommendation to keep moving before the cold learned too much about fingers. Nobu adjusted the tie on his bundle and fell in beside him with an ease that did not need. Rehearsal. The stronghold received them as it receives weather, adapting without announcing its effort. Guards at the gate stamped their feet not from fear, but to remind blood of its duty. In the inner gallery, mats had been shaken and set smooth. The smell of rice lifting from the lunch pot was a small mercy against the day's iron. Lanterns made their amber with the steadiness of good habits. Brushes had been rinsed and placed to dry on folded cloth. Takeshi brought the emblem to his room and set it on the low chest where his blades rested at night, beside the oiled card marked with the faint charcoal wing he had taken from the grove after the attack. The two small things held their counsel well. Together, they tilted the room's balance by a degree only he would feel. He retied the red knot below his short blade's guard, the cloth remembering his touch and then forgetting it, as cloth must. Nobu in the hall sat on his heels and wiped melted snow from the straps of his sandals with a care that made them look almost new. He did not look into the room. He let the doorframe be a boundary winter could approve. Later, when the day had lowered itself toward early dusk, the kind that arrives before the mind expects it in this season, Takeshi stood again at the window and watched the courtyard settle. Snow fell more thinly, as if practicing for evening. The water chains ticked and paused, learning the night's pace. He took the emblem into his hand once more and felt that moon-cool curve, the carved needles inside there. Circle, the nick whose story only two men had known. Sayori's words moved through him again, not as rules, but as shapes to be placed like stones on a stream, so that water could make its music without tearing the banks. Duty would ask for him at dawn. Revenge would ask for him at any hour he chose. Between the two, a narrow path showed itself snow-smoothed, quiet, exacting a way that offered him the work of seeing clearly and of speaking little until speech could save breath. The emblem did not tell him which to choose. It made choosing unavoidable. He stepped out into the court as the first. Lanterns were being lit. Men moved with their tasks learned. Women came and went between doorways with bowls and cups, and none of them looked at him longer than kindness allows. Nobu followed at a respectful distance, the young vow steady in his posture, the lesson of the snow sitting well in his breath. The world accepted their motion, but before the bell, before the lines of evening had fully drawn themselves, Takeshi returned alone to the low gate at the garden edge, where a pine bends in the snowbanks in a careful crescent. He stood under the quiet tree with the emblem in his palm, the air bright in the way only cold air can be, the smell of winter's iron faint and clean and honest. In the distance, beyond the walls, the winter fields lay as they had in morning, the same and not the same, a page that can be written on again without tearing. He closed his hand around the emblem, not as a fist, not as a claim, only to keep it from the wind. The silence around him thickened into something that was not peace and not threat, a stillness with weight, like a warning spoken by a friend who refuses to dramatize. Snow sifted down through the pine's green, found his sleeve and hat, and the plane of his cheek, and did not melt quickly. The bell inside the house kept the hour. The choice waited without impatience. He stood there alone, not lonely, while winter placed its hand upon the province. The emblem lay against his skin, colder than it had a right to be, warmer than a memory should be, and in its weight he felt both grief and a direction. The wind thickened for a breath and then thinned, carrying no words, only the certainty that the hidden fire was nearer than the world believed. The day surrendered quietly to early dusk. The snowbed at his feet showed no blood now, only the white that remembers. He did not move. The stillness held, unresolved and exact, like a string, drawn not to play a note but to be ready for one. Snow held the morning to a lower light, a pale weight on eaves and railings, a softened edge along every stone. The stronghold breathed in its winter rhythm, water chains ticking in patient intervals, braziers giving off disciplined heat, attendants sweeping with strokes that made no sound beyond the whisper of straw and wood. A bell, struck once and then again, called a measured summons through the galleries. Its tone was not urgent. It carried the authority of routine. Takeshi stood, tightened the red knot beneath the guard of his short blade, and slid his door aside. The corridor met him with the clarity of cedar and cold air, lanterns pared down to small, steady ovals, incense from the morning offering lingering like a respectful thought that knows when to leave. His sandals touched planks that had been wiped of melt. The wood received him with a quiet willingness. Nobu fell in behind, one pace back and a little to the left. Footfalls aligned to the older man's rhythm until, within a few steps, they could have belonged to a single body learning how to be two. The turnings toward the Hall of Pine felt longer than on other days, not because distance had changed, but because the house had asked every corner to grant them a breath for silence. On a side shelf, a small basin held unfrozen water. A sprig of pine leaned above it, droplets on its needles like accounting made without fingers. The smell of ink grew stronger with each archway. A retainer bowed them through, sleeves folded neatly in, eyes lowered not from fear, but from respect for the hour. The hall had been swept, raked, and set. Tatami lay in perfect geometry. The seams ran straight as if winter itself had drawn them. Lanterns breathed a low, amber light, each flame trimmed so carefully that its flicker felt like deliberate thought. In a far alcove, a scroll of a solitary. Pine bowed slightly into emptiness, brush hairs visible where the stroke had thinned. Incense rose from a small bronze burner, a fine smoke that carried bitter and sweet in equal measure, then surrendered itself to the cool. Lord Kinsei sat where he always sat in such hours, back straight behind the low desk, sleeve falling in a single line, hands resting with open restraint. His face had the stillness of a well-kept pond under ice. No sound in the room challenged that stillness. It organized itself around him and found its level. Takeshi approached the boundary and knelt. His palms found the mat as if they had been taught specifically for this piece of Russian thread. He bowed. The bow lengthened one breath beyond custom, then returned to upright. Nobu knelt to the right and a pace back, head lowered, hands flat. The line of his spine, honest.daigo, stood at a respectful angle within the lantern's reach, neither fully in the light nor hiding from it, sleeves gathered so that hands could disappear if they wished. His robe was unremarkable in color and exact in its care. A single roll of paper lay on a tray beside him, weighted by a small stone carved in the shape of a crane's wing, a gift, perhaps, or an old inkstone no longer used for ink. He lifted the paper between finger and thumb and did not yet unroll it. The gesture said as much as words might have. Kensei spoke first, his voice quiet and even. "Takeshi, my lord." "A matter of order," Kensei said. He let the weight of the phrase settle. "This house desires clarity." "Clarity," Takeshi answered, "is a duty." Daigo inclined his head without presumption. "Clarity is also a mercy," he said softly, "for those who are mistaken." Kensei's gaze did not move to him, did not move at all. "Daigo." The advisor unrolled the paper with the care a man gives to something that must not be creased. The lantern's light made the meanest strokes visible. Little hairs in the ink trailed like frost along a reed. He raised the sheet no higher than necessary. "Reports," he said, from the northern line. A breath, grain cut before its time. Another breath, shrines disturbed. He placed the paper down, signs left. He lifted from the tray a card oiled against weather, its edges singed in the way of something meant to be remembered as heat rather than flame. On its face, faint charcoal had traced two strokes that crossed where a seal would have sat. No seal marked it. The shape, in the right mind, might make a wing. "This," Daigo said, "found after a night's trouble in the eastern grove." His eyes flicked not to Takeshi, but to the line of mats between them, as if the mat might be the one to answer. "A mark of correspondence used by the thieves we hunt." He set the card a careful span from the roll of paper. Then, without haste, he produced the emblem Takeshi had found in the snow, the small, lacquered crest of 3 needles in a bound ring with its dried brown arc. where blood had made an argument with winter and lost. The emblem lay like a coin placed on a ledger. "This," Dago said, "taken from the returning man's sleeve." He did not say taken from the field and brought home in respect. He did not say given or surrendered. The verb rested on the table, without a pedigree. Kensei's breath did not change. The incense burned and bent and righted itself as the air moved. Takeshi kept his eyes steady, not fixed on the proof and not avoiding it. He did not need to look to know the neck along the ring. The nick lived in his hand, whether the emblem lay near or far. Dago continued, his voice toned for a hall where meanings are supposed to be carried, not thrown. "Before that night," he said, "messages pried from shrine stones. Farmers questioned. A rider seen at field corners at hours when good men sleep. He did not say who rode. He did not have to. His words gave the shapes and then allowed the listener to supply a name. He drew one more thing from a sleeve, the strap end with the engraved wing, its rim browned where he had touched it and been taken away. He set it so the three small objects made a triangle that contained the lantern flame within their lines when seen from a certain angle. Taken together, Dago said, these require explanation. Kensei inclined his head a fraction, the movement as spare as a winter gesture should be. Speak. Takeshi answered with the same measure the room expected from a man who has known both snow and summer. I found the emblem in the field. It belonged to Kazuo. Nobu's breath shifted and then steadied. Takeshi continued. I brought it home. That is all the story it will give. Dago's smile did not happen in his mouth. It happened in the angle of his sleeve. And the card? He asked. In the grove, Takeshi said, after the knives. I removed it, so the house would not wake to worry. Ah, Dago said, as if understanding had been offered a small delicacy, a kindness. Prudence, Takeshi said. The strap end? Kensei asked. In the snow, Takeshi answered. Beside, a branch that chose to empty itself. Fire has kissed it, Dago observed. Not ours. Not ours, Takeshi repeated. Asterisk silence resumed its duty. No one moved to disturb it. A coal shifted in the brazier with a dry note that sounded like a cough from a room 3 doors away. The men assembled held their quiet with the integrity of people who have been taught that noise is a poverty. Dago folded his hands within his sleeves. The northern line, he said, suffers a hunger for mischief. Grain cut, court severed, word sold. A sign burned where messages meet, an emblem drawn from snow the day after snow returns. A faithful retainer visits shrines at night to keep the house asleep. His head tilted a degree, a pattern wishes to be seen. Kensei turned his eyes to Takeshi at last, not as a blade turns, but as ice reflects the shape of a bird passing above. Speak fully. Takeshi bowed and did not hurry his return to. Upright, I went to the shrine the night before last, he said, to listen. In that listening, Sayori spoke. She warned of a fire that warms sleeves and leaves no ash. In the grove, masked men came. We sent them away. The card was left where feet stumble. His gaze touched the oiled paper and left it again. Yesterday, we walked the fields. The emblem was there in winter's keeping. I brought it home. The strap end lay beneath a branch's burden. I brought that as well. He did not add that the strap's line and the card's wing agreed with each other like two liars meeting in a crowd. The room knew its appetite for inference. Dago lifted one finger a little, content to let the bend of knuckle mean deference. Sayori's words, he said, are music. Music is a poor witness. We have the cleaner evidence of objects. He nudged the emblem with the edge of the carved wing stone, not enough to move it, enough to declare contact. Marks burned, messages pried, stolen food. A man of skill moving at hours when such skill cuts loyalties as easily as cords. His glance did not stay anywhere long enough to be seen as stare. "We honor Kazuo in this house," he said softly. "But honor is not a shield for those who mistake grief for license." Nobu's head rose a finger's width. He pressed his palms harder to the mat to stop the motion. The gesture told the room he would speak and was asking his body for permission to do so without disrespect. Kensei's eyes did not leave Takeshi. "Is there more?" Takeshi allowed breath to travel all the way down before he answered. "I did my duty," he said. "I do not argue with weather. I watch. I carry what I find. I bring it home. I do not warm my hands where the house cannot see." Dago turned the stone wing with a thumb so it faced a different lantern. "And yet men were cut in our bamboo," he said, "not bandits. Hired to test boundaries. Someone told them where to walk. Someone within our wall." Nobu raised his head fully now. "They came to strike Takeshi Dono," he said, the honorific placed like a bowl on a table. "We saw their eyes above the cloth. They were paid to end a loyalty, not to serve one." His voice held. It trembled only at the end. Dago's bow towards the young man was almost tender. "Zeal is a fine fuel for youth," he murmured. "It burns." His eyes returned to Kensei. "My lord, the pattern is patient, but not endless. If we do not correct it now, winter will carry it into spring." Kensei's hands, resting open on the desk, closed and then reopened a movement so small it might have been the correction of a sleeve. He looked at the card, at the strap, at the emblem. His face did not interpret them for the room. It refused to be their mirror. When he spoke, his tone had no warmth to give and no need to fake any. "We keep order," he said. "Order preserves those who cannot preserve themselves." "Just so," Dago breathed. Kensei lifted his gaze again and held it on. Takeshi, as if he were recalling the sightline of a wall long rebuilt but measured once by the same eyes. "Loyalty is not feeling," he said. "It is a structure." "Yes," Takeshi said. "The structure," Kensei continued, "requires that a stain be removed when it appears, even if the cloth resists." He did not raise his voice for the sentence that followed. "Takeshi, you have brought evidence of your blood to my table. It sits among signs left by hands that wish us harm. I cannot untie your hand from theirs in the view the house must hold." He paused for the length of a shallow breath. "You will leave these walls?" The words did not fall. They occupied. Lanterns did not flicker. The incense wavered and drew itself straight again. The tatami stayed under every weight as it always had. Nobu's palms lifted the smallest distance from the mat, then settled again. "My lord," he said, and the tremor was a narrow river held between banks. "Enough," Kensei said, without hardness. "The house speaks once." Dago bowed, depth exact and duration modest. "Order preserved," he said, as if repeating a lesson that had finally been learned. Takeshi bowed until the crown of his head nearly met the mat. He remained there until his pulse stopped arguing with itself. When he straightened, the breath that carried him upward said nothing to the room but allowed the room to hear it. He did not reach for the emblem. He let it remain beside the strap, and the card 3 small objects that had learned how to accuse by proximity. Kensei added a final line, voice always even. "Chains would declare a certainty I do not claim. You will go. You will not return without my word." "In this weather," Dago offered, "exile can be mercifully brief." Kensei did not acknowledge the cruelty that had borrowed mercies. "Robe, guards," he said, and the word was all the permission habit needed. 2 men stepped from the shadow near the door. Their armor did not clatter. The cords had been wrapped to prevent such talk. Their faces were neither welcoming nor hostile. They were present the way winter is present and inescapable. Unexcited by the name men give it, they approached to bind. Takeshi rose before hands could find rope. The movement surprised no one and startled nothing. He bowed once more, this time, toward the memorial tablet in the side alcove, where ash had been smoothed with the morning's first light so that grief could have a place to face. He bowed to Kensei, depth proper, duration proper, and then to the hall itself, as one bows to a boat that has carried weight well. No word followed. He did not appeal. He had been taught since youth that appeals are for times when structures want to be saved. This structure had decided its shape for now. NOBU stood. The young man's hands shook once and then steadied on the strap across his chest. He looked to the Lord as a son looks to a father he hopes will alter the day. "Permit me to go with him," he said. The words had no ornament. They were the exact size of the breath that bore them. Kensei did not turn away, did not narrow his eyes, did not ask for argument. "You have a place here," he said. "Do not be foolish." "Loyalty," Nobu answered, "is carried." Dago's smile returned to his sleeve. "The boy is earnest," he said, and let the compliment become its own rebuke. Kensei did not address the advisor. He spoke to air that has already made up its mind. "If you walk past the gate," he told Nobu, "you are no longer of this house." "Yes," Nobu said, "I understand." Takeshi inclined his head a fraction, the way men speak to each other when there is no time for gentleness, and the gentleness must be carried anyway. "Come," he said, and the single word held permission and warning at once. He turned. The guards trained to close on a man who might break found themselves corrected by a posture that refused to be enemy. They fell in behind at a distance that looked like escort, and perhaps it was. The hall released them to the corridor. The corridor's planks gave the old answer to bare feet, then to sandals, a rhythm that had learned the house's pace and would keep it even when names changed. They crossed back past the garden court where snow had arranged itself into new curves since morning, where the bamboo had accepted its white with an equanimity no wind could purchase. The water chain ticked and paused, holding its small fractions of time up to light. In a shallow alcove, a tiny shrine kept its cup of rice from freezing by proximity to a brazier. The smoke from a single incense stick curved, and then straightened, as if deciding to stand with the man once he had passed. Sayori waited in a shadow that did not have to hide her. She did not step forward. She lowered her eyes in a bow that a passerby could have missed. "When paper learns to be flame," she said, almost voiceless, "stone learns to speak." It was not a plea. It was an account. Her hands were empty. The emptiness felt correct. Takeshi's eyes acknowledged her without turning. He had no reply to give that would not reduce what had already been said to a smaller version of itself. Nobu bowed to her with the humility of one who suddenly understands why riddles exist. The postern accepted them. The bar was lifted by a guard whose face worked to keep habit from becoming grief. Cold air entered the corridor like truth. It carried the clean iron of snow, the resin of pines holding their own weight, the thinnest echo of river under ice. Outside, the world had a different brightness, one that does not flatter, one that gives men back to themselves unadorned. They crossed the threshold and stepped into the pale, steady light. Snow compressed beneath their sandals with that fine, articulate crunch that speaks in syllables too old for complaint. Breath lifted in brief penance and then dissolved. The gate behind them did not slam. It closed the way winter closes a door patiently, thoroughly, with the confidence of hinges that know their work. Takeshi paused once to fasten the cord at his sleeve. Nobu did the same without being told. The walls of the stronghold lay at their backs in Saracen perfection stone exact, banners asleep, torches lit for the hour, not for warmth. Dago's eyes, somewhere beyond, undoubtedly watched from a place chosen to capture the line of two men against white and make it into a sentence he could write later. Kensei remained within, unmoved and unmoving, order kept with the detachment of a man who refuses to let grief instruct policy. Asterisk, where Nobu asked the word respectful, the question a necessity. North first, Takeshi said, where winter speaks plainly. They walked. Snow returned their measure, and the measure kept both men honest. Older stride calibrated by discipline, younger stride improved by imitation. The sound of the chain's last ticks, faint behind them, agreed that the hour had turned. Ahead, the fields opened. Wind traveled low, not with spite, but with insistence. A crow moved from one bare tree to another and shook down a small shower. No other witness remarked upon leaving. Dishonored, yes. Unbroken, also yes. The cold gave him both truths without commentary. In his sleeve, the strap end with its brown rim pressed a small, unambiguous circle into his wrist. In his chest, the emblem's weight, though left on the Lord's table, drew a shape as precise as if he still held it. Sayori's lines arranged themselves like stones across a thought stream, offering a way to cross without wetting the foot. Behind, the house resumed its breathing. Ahead, the air cleared itself of incense and remembered only pine. They did not look back. The gate disappeared into the carefully falling snow, and the day simplified to path, breath, and a silence that had learned to carry injustice without letting it rot into bitterness. The province extended in winter truth fields. White, woods attenuated, the far ridge a low incline beneath a soft sky. In that truth, exile felt less like loss than like work recommencing in a new room without walls, order to be sought not within ceremonies, but within the way a man sets his foot and keeps his mouth and places his blade back in its scabbard without noise. They went on, dishonored but unbroken, into a cold that did not recognize either word, and therefore could be trusted. Snow had taught the mountains a slow language, and for days Takeshi and Nobu walked inside it. The world spoke in measured syllables, the soft crunch underfoot that never hurried. The thin thread of wind laid along a ridge like a reed across a bowl. The whisper of snow deciding to fall from a bough and then thinking better of it. The path climbed in white curves between black trunks and gray stone. Breath made brief banners before the face and then surrendered. Their sandals learned. The mountain's caution heel said shallow, weight lowered, the ball of the foot listening before it answered. Each step offered itself to the cold and was accepted without ceremony. They carried little and asked less. The sword at Takeshi's side settled into the winter as if it had been made for this light and this quiet. The red mount beneath the guard, darkened by frost and breath, lay like a small coal that refused to go out. Nobu walked a pace behind and to the left, a habit now so steady it no longer required thought. He watched the older man's shoulders for the changes of rhythm a ridge demands. With small adjustments that turned danger into economy, the boy's eyes had learned winter's scale. They did not reach for what distance would not give. Ravens marked them once and let them pass. Fox tracks stitched the low meadows where the wind had not ironed the snow smooth. A temple bell, far beyond sight, wandered into the air at an hour without name and struck twice, the sound flat with cold, then gone. The mountain accepted the sound and continued. This is how ritual survives weather, Takeshi thought by learning to say only what it must. Toward evening, the path narrowed to a pass where old stones had been set not to keep men out, but to teach. Their steps humility. Here the wind was a blade drawn but not swung. It made the edges sharper without raising a hand. Beyond the notch, tucked into a fold of rock, lay a deserted temple. No roof for crowds, no gate for processions, only a low hall with eaves bowed by years and a shallow porch where the snow drifted as if invited to practice balance. A rope hung before a bell whose clapper had frozen into its own curve. Prayer flags strung along the lintel were stiff as bark, their colors dimmed to patience by weather. A brazier, a shallow iron bowl on 3 legs, sat on the step, half-filled, with last year's ash that had turned to powder, and taken on the day's silence. They stood and let their breathing find the porch's measure. In the cold, there's always the smell of iron, faint and clean as a rule. It lay under the wood sour of the temple, under the resin that the pines kept even in sleep. The snow lifted in small plumes where the wind remembered a corner. In such places, one sees what remains when ornament has gone. Nobu drew nearer, stopping short of shadow. He did not speak. The temple knew the presence of men who would rather be visitors than owners, and he behaved as the place asked. Takeshi's gaze moved across the steps, the posts, the black seam where Eve met wall, and the wind's speech thinned into a whisper. He recognized a carefulness new to the place, snow disturbed where it should have been smooth. The faint line of a heel where a man accustomed to avoiding marks had measured his weight and been betrayed by a powder finer than his skill. A thread of scent that did not belong to stone or pine, the dry clove that attends, sleeves that keep company with ink. Dago stepped from the dark like a sentence spoken in a language the room had always known. He wore a traveling cloak cut plain and exact, its hem brushed clean of snow as if out of habit even in wind. The robe beneath was the color of ash well kept. No crust showed, nothing needed to. His hands were inside his sleeves in the familiar way of men who pretend warmth into their bones. The face was unchanged by weather thought held in place by decision, eyes steady and cool as a winter pool that hides slow fish. Takeshi, he said, and the name did not travel far in the cold. My lord's voice is not here, Takeshi answered, only the wind. Dago's mouth made a shape almost like kindness. Order travels without a voice. Nobu's fingers found the wrap of his hilt and rested there, not grasping, only locating. Takeshi's hand made no search. It knew its place. Naoton took the few words and set them aside where silence stores what it intends to remember. Dago glanced once at the brazier, then back. You should have let winter do its work, he said. It absolves without the difficulty of procedure. Winter absolves nothing, Takeshi said. It preserves. The advisor stepped down into the shallow drift and left careful prints. Toe first, feel gentle, the marks of a man who understood both snow and witnesses. There are debts, he said, that cannot be paid inside walls. The house requires that they be taken to the past and resolved where breath is honest. Breath is always honest, Takeshi said. Words are the trouble. Dago's eyes accepted the rebuke as if he had ordered it. We will let steel measure our patience then, he said. He looked past Takeshi to the boy. Stand out. Of wind, young one, Nobu did not move. I will see, he said. The 4 short sounds clipping the air like a sparrow's feet on a branch. Takeshi did not turn. You will witness, he said quietly. Do not enter the line. Nobu bowed, the bow shallow because snow punishes deeper gestures. The wind took a wick of hair from his brow and laid it aside with the same small care the boy used to lay. A blade on a stand. He stepped back to the lee of a stone. Dago drew his sword as one might draw a brush from its case, without flourish, without apology, a simple revelation of purpose. The steel took on the moon's thin light and did not return it. It held it and made it a strip of night inside night. Takeshi loosened the red knot beneath the guard of his short blade and retied it. The knot rested against lacquer like a sealed trusting paper. He touched the longer sword then, not to test edge or weight. Those knew him, but to remind the hand of the shallow sound the mouth of the scabbard makes when it gives permission. He breathed once low. The breath looked like a small cloud. then lost itself among others. They bowed. The temple accepted the bow without altering its sleep. The robe before the bell swayed and did not ring. Dago's feet spread the width of duty. Takeshi's found the width of economy. Neither man hurried to cut the cold with movement. Winter loves slowness, and they obliged. The first steps were not toward each other so much as toward necessity. Snow gave beneath each sole with the soft, articulate crunch that lives only in certain temperatures and has no words. Dago's blade rose and settled into a line that would be a question if he wished. Takeshi let his point rest lower, a promise. To answer without inviting argument, they moved again. Breath counted the distance. Wind counted the seconds. The mountain kept both counts and made no report. Dago fainted as a man opens a paper clean. Without haste, without waste, Takeshi refused the invitation by not reading. Steel met steel once, quietly, a small bright contact that vanished in. The same moment it announced itself. Dago's shoulders made a subtle correction skill, acknowledging skill in a way that would have pleased both men if they were other men. He took a half step that meant to close a door. Takeshi let the door remain open and got his hand back without cost. Snow lifted and fell again in the space their bodies made. A whisper of white confetti in a ceremony no one would celebrate. "You are tenacious," Dago said, almost without breath. "I am patient," Takeshi said. "Patience becomes stubbornness. When it refuses truth, truth is not yours to distribute." Dago's mouth tilted. The house disagrees. They circled as much as the pass allowed. Not wolves, not dancersmen measuring ground in an hour when ground mattered more than intent. The long edge of rock to Takeshi's right gathered the wind into a steady blade. The temple's porch, to his left, argued for stillness. He chose stillness and let the wind insult him. The insult cost little. The reply would cost more. Dago's cut came from above his shoulder and slanted, away, a painter's stroke that wished to remove a burden cleanly. Takeshi answered with the beginning of a block, and then allowed his arm to soften a fraction, stealing the cut's hunger rather than stopping it. The steel slid. Snow hushed the memory of their contact so quickly that Nabu might have imagined he had dreamed it. The second cut arrived a hand lower and looked for the ribs. Takeshi stepped into it with the slightest forward pressure and let the line find cloth and not what the cloth protected. A red thread showed itself and then disappeared among larger whites. Dago saw the stain. His eyes warmed, not with kindness, but with relief at proof. "You are almost done," he said. Takeshi did not answer. The wind answered for him with a, "Then climb up the pass." They paused, and the pause contained everything. The temple, the bell, the old ash, the stiff flags, the boy in the lee of stone holding his breath in the right place. In that pause, Sayori's voice returned to Takeshi like a low winter sun, the burning crane, the hidden fire that warms sleeves and leaves no ash, the vessel of loyalty, the blade of silence. He drew breath and let each line seat itself where it belonged. He lifted his sword as a man lifts a ladle, simple, functional enough. When they moved again, inevitability had chosen its speed. Dago, too wise for drama, abandoned the large cut and brought his point in narrow, the method of a scribe correcting a small error in a ledger. Takeshi allowed it to come, and in allowing, accepted that the ledger would draw a line through him. Steel entered. Heat bloomed under cold like a spring discovered beneath ice. He did not step back. He took the wound into his structure and wrote his answer on the same line the cut had. Made. His blade rose without sound and then fell on a plane that winter approved. It traveled the shortest honest distance between two truths. It met Dago at the unguarded angle between pride and habit, a place even in winter the body cannot completely harden. The advisor's mouth opened as if prepared to give a final order to the room, and, found itself speaking nothing. They stood close as men at a whisper. The snow beneath them took their weight the way old mats take a ceremony and keep it for the wood below. Dago's eyes searched Takeshi's face for an argument he could win. He found none and lowered his chin a degree that could be taken for respect by those who need such things. He sank to his knees, not the bow of a retainer, not the collapse of a coward, merely a man receiving the last instruction weather will give. His sword fell and cut a neat notch into the drift, stood there for a moment like a reed set in a pond, then leaned and disappeared. On his sleeve, as the wind lifted it, the faint mark of a wing revealed itself where cloth had been warmed once, and no ash had remained. It was not a crest, it was a habit. The habit ended. Dago leaned onto his left hand, looked at the temple as if about to ask forgiveness from a thing that does not give it, and then lay down. The snow accepted him with the exact courtesy it had shown to stones and small fallen branches. Nobu exhaled as one who has remembered he is allowed to. He stepped forward and stopped. Takeshi lowered his blade slowly, not because his arm had grown heavy, but because the world deserved to see the last motion done without haste. He sheathed. The mouth of the scabbard gave that small correct note that has ended so many hours. It felt larger now, as small things do when they must carry a last. The wound made itself plain. Warmth moved under his layers with an authority cold could not argue with. His breath shortened and learned a new shape. He walked to the brazier and sat on the step with the ease of a man who has done so 1,000 times in other winters. And only when his weight touched the wood did he allow his hand to oppose the pressure inside him. Nobu knelt at his side and did not try to reach through the cloth. He set his palm flat on the step instead, aligning his fingers with the grain as if that were the help needed. Snow fell with a careful hand. The wind cut once and then left them to their own count. The temple remained as it had been, wood and line and purpose abandoned, but not forgotten. Takeshi looked at the boy and saw in him the outline of something not yet named, but already true. "Listen," he said. The word made a cloud and then was nothing. Nobu inclined his head. "The path continues." Takeshi said. "Yes," Nobu answered, as if the mountain had spoken and he was the echo. "Carry it," Takeshi said, quietly. Nobu's hand lifted and settled on the scabbard of the long sword, as if to demonstrate he had already begun. "I will. Do not warm your hands at hidden fires. I will not. Speak only to save breath. Yes." "Loyalty," Takeshi said, and paused to let the word clear the air, "is carried." Nobu bowed, the bow minimal because the winter punished extravagance. "I will carry." Takeshi untied the red knot beneath the guard with fingers that had taught that knot its duty. He wrapped the cloth around the boy's wrist and secured it with a twist that would not slip toward the wrong hand. He took the long sword from his own hip, the blade that had waked him in dark hours and slept by him in summer, and set it across Nobu's knees. The steel, facing up, gathered what moon there was and held it with the restraint the two men now shared. "For Kazuo," Takeshi said, and the name made the air warmer by the smallest degree. "For Kensei's house when it remembers itself, for those who cannot lift a bowl without help." Nobu's throat worked. He kept his voice level. "I will carry." Takeshi leaned back against the post, and the post held as posts do when men need them to. He looked toward the pass and the line of ridge beyond, where the sky had begun to lose a shade of black to a thinner gray. Sayori's phrases walked the distance into him: the burning crane, the vessel that does not leak, the stone that speaks. When paper turns to flame, he did not search for the meaning as if it were a coin dropped in snow. He accepted that the meaning had already found him in the work he had been given and in the way he had done it. His breath shortened to fit the hour. He let it. There was no struggle left that would not dishonor the work. He lifted his hand once, placed it on the boy's shoulder, and felt bone beneath cloth. Young strength that winter had not yet had time to argue into wisdom. He set the weight there gently, as one sets a small pot on a stable stove. "Keep your mouth closed," he said, a hint of a smile touching the edge of the words, "until speech can save breath." Nobu's eyes lifted and then lowered. "Yes, do not sharpen your blade with anger. It dulls faster than stone." "Yes, if you must choose," Takeshi said, and now the air was a little farther away than it had been. "Choose the work." He closed his eyes. The cold did not enter him. He entered the cold, and the cold received him as the house had once received him. Cedar, ink, tatami, order. The snow around the brazier took on a warmth it could not keep, and then forgot. It in the way snow must. The temple's bell rope moved the smallest amount, and the clapper made a sound too shy to be a note. Nobu waited long enough to learn what silence knows. He did not hurry any part of the last minute. When it had done its work, he lifted the long sword with both hands and felt in its weight the shape of the years ahead, the practice yards and weather, the roads with their winter council and summer dust, the rooms where order is a structure and not a feeling, the shrines that keep more secrets than they ask to be told. He fixed the red knot at his wrist and tightened it to the measure that would keep it faithful through rain and snow. He bowed to the man at rest as one bows to a teacher and to a brother he had not earned but had been given. Heroes. The sky had begun the slow unfastening that leads to dawn, the eastern line thinner, then thinner again, as if the night were being shaved by a careful hand. Snow caught the first pallor and returned it in a quiet that felt like inheritance rather than gift. The wind changed direction as if deciding not to push. Nobu stepped down from the porch and into the drift. The crunch answered him. Breath made its small banner and dissolved. He turned to the pass behind him. The temple kept the last of its warmth where it had always kept such things, in wood and ash, and a corner where sandals are placed with their toes together. Before him, the mountain opened its book to the next blank page. Sayori's prophecy traveled with him without needing to be recalled, the crane that burns without ash, the silence that cuts when it must, the vessel of loyalty that must be kept, filled with water, not fire. He did not look for the advisor's body. The snow would take that business. He did not look back at the man who had entrusted him with tomorrow. The path did not require it. It required walking. He set the sword across his back and held the scabbard in a hand that had learned stillness. The first clear thread of dawn found the ridge and laid itself there, not as triumph, but as a line men could follow. He followed. The hour did not celebrate. It accepted. In that acceptance, the vow grew quiet and large, alone yet not alone. Nobu moved into the new light with a blade that would ask him to be exact. Behind him, snow remembered the weight of a man who had finished his work. Ahead, the world made room for another to carry it. The wind crossed the pass and did not interfere. The mountain's slow language continued, and he entered it, step by steady step, as the day began.